Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 721 through 730 of the previous episode. Qian Ping'an reflects on the escalating conflict between the Great Li Empire and the luminous Vermilion Empire as he journeys north with Zheng Yi. Seeking shelter from the heavy snow at a derelict Taoist enforcer temple, Qian Ping'an carefully monitors Zheng Yi's mental state during his initial cultivation session. He then steps outside into the courtyard and uses compassionate reasoning to peacefully turn away a group of residual, semi-conscious entities, before engaging in a profound discussion with a deceased military officer regarding the preservation of moral integrity on the battlefield. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 731. Late in the night, Qian Ping'an retrieved his calligraphy brush and some paper and recorded the names and birthplaces of the military officer as well as his 600 or so soldiers, saying that a friend of his would hold 2 heavenly worship ceremonies and liberation rites of water and land in the future. At that time, he would try to include their names among those who were being honored. While Qian Ping'an was completing this task, Zheng Yi opened the door of the main hall following the completion of his cultivation session, providing quite a lot of help to Qian Ping'an and the 10 or so entities. Qian Ping'an was naturally fluent in the official dialect of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, and he wasn't unfamiliar with the official dialect of the luminous Vermilion Empire used by the cultivators and commoners in Bamboo Scroll Lake either. However, he was given quite a headache when dealing with the accent of the Stonebrush Nation. Fortunately, Zheng Yi arrived in a timely manner and resolved the communication issues between Qian Ping'an and the entities. They were busy with the task all the way until the roosters crowed in the morning, and it was only then that Qian Ping'an finished recording all of the names and birthplaces of the 600 or so entities. Entities didn't necessarily need to retreat when the sun rose and the roosters started to crow, and some ghosts with powerful energy could travel through the living world without any issues even when it was day. Of course, this was as long as they avoided the blazing sun of noon. The notion of entities retreating to rest when the roosters crowed was similar to the notion of humans waking up to work in the morning. This was nothing more than nature. When Qian Ping'an finished writing, the deceased military officer with the surname Wei said that the time for farewell was imminent, so he wanted to go for a stroll outside the Taoist enforcer temple with Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an naturally wouldn't turn down his request. When the two of them walked past the front hall and exited the temple, the military officer from the Stonebrush Nation chuckled softly and asked, "Esteemed Immortal Qian, are you an official immortal from another nation? Or else you wouldn't be so unfamiliar with the official dialect of this place." Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "I come from the north." The military officer subconsciously rubbed his neck and chuckled. "It doesn't matter even if you're from the Great Li Empire. I have to concede that the heavy cavalry from the Great Li Empire is truly very powerful." There was no need for the accompanying cultivators to participate in the battles, with one side thinking it was unnecessary and one side not daring to seek death. Our armies were almost equal in size, yet the battles were completely one-sided. It was only because the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire dismounted that the battles between our armies were still relatively intense. Even so, the soldiers of the Stonebrush Nation were no match for their foes. We felt extremely stifled and helpless, and it was because of this that we died with regret and became entities. In saying this, we do somewhat acknowledge the strength of our enemies and accept our defeat. Qian Ping'an nodded in response. The military officer stopped walking and said, "I won't be nosy and ask anything else, but I'm not that naive either. I know that esteemed Immortal Qian is actually the one who's going to perform the heavenly worship ceremonies and the liberation rites of water and land, so..." The military officer released his hand from the hilt of his saber and shifted his armor slightly, preparing to kneel on a single knee to express his gratitude toward Qian Ping'an. He had to thank this esteemed immortal on behalf of his brothers. Qian Ping'an unexpectedly stepped forward and held the military officer's arms, preventing him from kneeling no matter what. Qian Ping'an smiled and said, "There's no need to do this. I don't deserve such a grand show of respect." The military officer had no option but to begrudgingly accept this, joking, "Esteemed Immortal Qian, why are you so polite? Perhaps you want me to die from shame once more." "I wouldn't dare to," Qian Ping'an replied with a shake of his head. Chan Ping'an held his hands inside his opposite sleeves, gazing into the distance where the faint light of day was gradually replacing the receding darkness of night. His voice was quiet as he said, "General Wei is actually far more impressive than me. You understood how to act correctly right from the very beginning, and this is a reflection of your genuine care for your companions. I'm not as swift and resolute as General Wei, and not only does this tire me out, but it even affects those around me and tires them out as well." The military officerine entity remained silent for a moment before asking, "Why don't you speak up when you feel tired? Is one not allowed to speak when one feels dissatisfied? And what is this about affecting those around you and causing them to feel tired as well? Esteemed Immortal Chan, even though I'm an outsider, I've experienced many ups and downs in my life, and I can say that it truly wasn't an easy life. I felt especially terrible when turning my saber toward my companions who lost their minds, and this was a feeling worse than being struck by the sabers of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry. When I felt so pained that I felt like I couldn't take it anymore, I privately called over a few of my brothers and gave them a good beating. Otherwise, I would have gone insane a long time ago, and I might have turned into a malicious ghost before my other brothers lost their minds. At that time, I would have been the one bringing harm to the world. So, esteemed Immortal Chan, you shouldn't think." Chan Ping'an carefully ruminated over this before smiling and saying, "Thank you, I feel much better after hearing General Wei's words." Military Officer Wei laughed heartily and replied, "I'm not a general or whatnot, and I was simply a martial artist and a 6th-rank official. In fact, I was only an honorary official. However, the generals who wielded genuine power and influence all fled or shirked from battle, and it was because of this that I ended up leading so many brothers." Upon saying this, he lightly stomped on the accumulated snow and remarked, "It was nothing but charging to death. There was nothing heroic about it, and it was simply a vexing matter." Chan Ping'an recalled something, and he retrieved a handful of snowflake coins and said, "These are immortal coins from the mountains, and you and your companions can absorb its spiritual energy to maintain your sanity. This is the least valuable type of immortal coin." Military Officer Wei hesitated for a moment before reaching over to accept the coins, saying in amusement, "Esteemed Immortal Chan can give us some more. I won't complain about the immortal coins being too heavy. I like money very much, and this remains the same in both life and death. After all, isn't silver the lightest thing in the world?" Chan Ping'an hurriedly waved his hands and chuckled. "I'm a bookkeeper now, so I'm extremely shrewd when it comes to making deals like these. I also know all of your names and birthplaces, so I'm very clear on how many immortal coins are needed to help you travel home." Military Officer Wei laughed heartily upon hearing this. There actually existed a so-called businessman who was afraid of other people not understanding his shrewdness? Since General Wei's birthplace is at the northern border of the Stonebrush Nation, are you planning to return north by yourself once you've bid farewell to all of your brothers? Chan Ping'an asked. Military Officer Wei was only in his early 30s, and he shook his head and replied, "There's no need for me to return. My parents passed away when I was young, and I don't have a wife or any children either. Everyone I know in my hometown is already dead." The emperor started to mobilize a significant number of troops the year before last, and apart from the northern border army that was extremely tough to begin with, several armies that were brave and capable were moved to the north as well. As for the self-ruling forces in the south such as the Huang clan, they were also summoned by the emperor, but they refused to comply, essentially starting a rebellion and viciously backstabbing everyone else. In fact, I'm very well aware that the Stonebrush Nation's spine has already been utterly shattered by the Great Li Empire. If General Wei is willing to, you can travel to Bamboo Scroll Lake's Cloud Pagoda City once you finish dealing with your matters," Chan Ping'an said slowly. "You can look for an 8th-tier sword cultivator called Du Shihu, and if he isn't in the city, then you can look for Plum Lane's Lu clan and ask their clan leader to introduce and take you to Cloud Pagoda City. Regardless of whether you go through Du Shihu or the Lu clan, someone from Cyan Gorge Island will naturally welcome you if you tell them that you're Chan Ping'an's friend. You can settle down near the mountain entrance of Cyan Gorge Island and temporarily stay at Sungye's place first. You can wait for us to return there. If General Wei is willing to do this, I can write a letter for you and also give you a token." Military Officer Wei smiled and asked, "Perhaps esteemed Immortal Chan or one of your friends is adept in the Tao of Ghosts. Perhaps you want to raise me into a ghost general?" It's only because esteemed immortal Chan is a great benefactor of mine that I'm asking this question. Otherwise, I wouldn't say anything at all and would simply agree on the surface. Afterward, I would wander around everywhere but refuse to go to Bamboo Scroll Lake. Please forgive me for being frank, esteemed immortal Chan. Truth be told, I have absolutely no interest in fighting anymore. If it's possible, I would rather do nothing and wait to disappear bit by bit. I would accept my fate. I can only hope to repay esteemed immortal Chen's great benevolence in my next life. Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, even though I know some secret techniques pertaining to the Tao of ghosts and possess 2 spirit tools capable of housing ghosts and entities, my hope is not to transform General Wei into a tool of mine. Instead, I'm simply unwilling to see General Wei disappear from the world just. If you believe in me and decide to go to Cyan Gorge Island, you're free to decide whether you stay or leave in the future. In fact, I won't agree even if General Wei voluntarily asks to become a ghost general. This is both a humiliating request and a self-humiliating ask. Military Officer Wei cupped his fists and said, your reassurance puts my mind at ease. Living a day longer is a day longer. As for how many of esteemed immortal Chen's immortal coins I spend during this time, let me make that shameless promise again. I can only hope to repay you in my next life. If I don't get the opportunity to repay you, then we can only say that esteemed immortal Chan still has room to improve as a bookkeeper. Chan Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a swig of wine. This was a rare case where Chan Ping'an was drinking because he wanted to, not because he needed to refresh himself and lift his spirits. Chan Ping'an wrote a letter after returning to the Taoist Enforcer Temple, and he also handed a Yang Energy Illumination Talisman and a small bamboo scroll made from a length of purple bamboo to Military Officer Wei. In the end, Chan Ping'an secretly handed him a lesser heat coin as well. It was already morning when Chan Ping'an finished doing all this. All of the entities temporarily retreated to rest in the front hall of the Taoist Enforcer Temple. Chan Ping'an returned to the main hall where he was greeted by Zheng Yi, who had already finished packing everything and was carrying the bamboo case and ready to leave. Chan Ping'an cupped his fists at the painted statue of the deity and apologized in a quiet voice. The 2 of us stayed the night here, and that group of entities is also seeking shelter in the front hall. Sorry for disturbing you. Zheng Yi had no option but to cup his fists and apologize as well. They exited the main hall, and when they walked past the front hall, Military Officer Wei simply cupped his fists to bid them farewell. He didn't open his mouth to say anything else. Chan Ping'an and Zheng Yi continued to travel north after leaving the Taoist Enforcer Temple. As they trudged through the snowy lands, Zheng Yi asked in a quiet voice, Mr. Chan, can I ask you a question? Chan Ping'an was bending down and casually scooping up some snow to wash his face at this moment, and he replied with a smile, go ahead. Mr. Chan, is there any need for you to spend so much money time and time again? Especially when you don't need to? Zheng Yi asked. Back at Thatch Moon Island, my master and everyone else all said that cultivators like us burn through the most silver, so if we don't understand how to be frugal regarding small matters, then we're destined to never achieve great things. Then do you think I'm destined to achieve great things? Chan Ping'an asked with a smile. Zheng Yi scratched his head and replied, of course. Mr. Chan is already a paramount cultivator. Then doesn't that explain everything? I'm already a paramount cultivator in your eyes, so it doesn't matter too much if I occasionally don't act frugal, Chan Ping'an said. Zheng Yi felt like Mr. Chan was always honest with other people, yet when it came to this matter, Mr. Chan was purposely not explaining things thoroughly. However, Zheng Yi was too shy to dig any deeper, seeing that Mr. Chan was unwilling to go into more detail. We stayed at a Taoist Enforcer Temple last night. So are you aware of the origin of Taoist Enforcers, as well as the responsibilities that these deities carry? Chan Ping'an asked with emotion. Zheng Yi shook his head and replied, I've only heard my master mention that they're deities of the Taoist sect who have an even longer history than mountain deities and water deities. Chan Ping'an smiled and said, then you should have heard of the old saying, there are gods in the heavens above, right? Taoist enforcers used to inspect the merits and faults of all people in the world. Even though this saying is slightly dated now, I still feel like believing it is much better than not believing it. This goes for both the common people and so-called cultivators like us. I feel like it's not a good thing if we're unafraid of heaven and earth and only afraid of evil people and evil ghosts. However, This is only my opinion, so you don't need to dwell on it too much. Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi nodded and replied, then I'll simply commit it to memory first. Perhaps it will prove useful one day. Chen Ping'an turned around and glanced at Zhang Yi, smiling as he did so. Zhang Yi felt slightly embarrassed and he asked, Mr. Chen, did I say something wrong again? Chen Ping'an shook his head, slowly walking forward and replying, no, what you said was very correct. Some principles are used for the sake of staying alive and for the sake of bettering our lives. Meanwhile, some other principles are used for the sake of making ourselves feel at ease. As for which principles are better and more suitable for the current moment, this is dependent on each person's unique circumstances and state of mind. At any rate, I feel like all of these principles are useful. You'll also learn many principles both big and small in the future, so take them out and ponder over them carefully whenever you encounter any issues. Only after doing this should you make a decision. Mr. Chan knows so many principles, Zhang Yi said sincerely. Chen Ping'an smiled and warned, you can give it a rest with such flattery in the future. There's no shortage of obsequious people around your Mr. Chan. Carrying the large bamboo case on his back, Zhang Yi turned around slightly and replied with a hearty laugh, but I'm the only one accompanying Mr. Chan right now, so I need to say more words of sincere flattery, lest Mr. Chan feel uncomfortable after not hearing praise for too long. Chen Ping'an smiled widely, suddenly squatting down and deftly building a palm-sized snowman before placing it on top of Zhang Ye's bamboo case. The tall young boy was extremely baffled. Chen Ping'an clapped his hands and explained, I'm going to perform an elementary fist stance in a moment, a very simple one where I simply throw a punch every 6 steps. You can copy my movements and learn the fist stance, but you have to guarantee that the small snowman doesn't fall off your bamboo case. I'll teach you 3 times, and I want you to perform this fist stance while we're traveling to our destinations. I won't force you to perform it, and you don't have to force yourself either. Just treat it as a way to relieve your boredom. After saying this, Chen Ping'an performed walking meditation 3 times for Zhang Yi. The young boy watched attentively, with his eyes laser-focused as he remembered each and every one of Chen Ping'an's footsteps and punches. Chen Ping'an saw all of this, and he told Zhang Yi to give the fist stance a try himself. Zhang Ye's movements were stable and accurate, and he seemingly managed to perform the fist stance even better than Chen Ping'an's first attempt in Clay Vase Alley. However, Chen Ping'an sighed in his mind instead. Zhang Yi was able to capture the movements but not the essence of the fist stance, meaning that it would take him many years to understand and master the basics. Zhang Ye's ability to comprehend fist techniques was far inferior to the skinny and fragile little boy, who had held a hatchet and stood in front of Chen Ping'an in the city located in the colorful garment nation's Blusher Prefecture. However, this wasn't a pressing matter. Just like Chen Ping'an had said, performing this fist stance was simply a way for Zhang Yi to relieve his boredom and pass time, lest they have to stare at each other and walk in awkward silence as they traveled from place to place. After all, the fox-skin beauty talismans couldn't be retrieved and activated too often. Moreover, Chen Ping'an was genuinely afraid of those femaline entities who were becoming increasingly lively and unrestrained in speech. So be it if they teased Zhang Yi, but why were they making bets in secret and coming over to awkwardly flirt with him as well? Were they not asking for embarrassment and humiliation? Just how many perilous dangers had Chen Ping'an overcome, and just how many huge events had he witnessed? Zhang Yi was ultimately a chi refiner who had been raised with more money than actual skills at Thatch Moon Island. Thus, he only managed to capture the surface-level form of the mountain shaking guide's walking meditation even though his physique was very strong. If Chen Ping'an didn't say anything, then Zhang Yi would feel quite satisfied with himself, especially since the small snowman on his bamboo case remained straight and steady the entire time. Chen Ping'an didn't perform walking meditation anymore after showing it to Zhang Yi 3 times. He would occasionally retrieve some geomancy maps to pore over. Night fell, and the 2 of them planned to set up camp in the wilderness. In any case, this wouldn't matter as long as it didn't snow. Chen Ping'an retrieved a fox-skin beauty talisman inside of which was a femaline entity called Su Xinjai. She was an abode-tier cultivator when alive, and she came from a clan in the Stone Brush Nation where her father favored males over females. A cultivator from an immortal force took a fancy to her aptitude when she was young, and she was thus taken to Yellow Barrier Mountain to officially set foot on the path of cultivation. Su Xinjai cultivated for a dozen or so years without ever returning home, and she had already severed all emotional attachments with her clan. Her father once traveled to the foot of Yellow Barrier Mountain to ask for an audience with his daughter, yet Su Xinjai remained in the mountain and refused to fulfill his request. Her father had hoped that she could help her brother in the imperial examination, yet his hopes were dashed and he could only swear and curse as he made his way back, speaking in the vilest way possible. It was very difficult to imagine that a father could say such disgusting things about his own daughter. Tailing her father in secret, Su Xinjai had heard everything loud and clear, leading her to feel utterly aggrieved and heartbroken. She had initially planned to help her clan this one time, yet she ultimately decided to sever all ties with the mortal world once and for all, returning to the mountain to cultivate. The final time Su Xinjai left the mountain to train, she and 2 other sex sisters were kidnapped by a Dragon Gate tier elder from Bamboo Scroll Lake's Whitefish Island. In the end, Su Xinjai died a wretched death as she was eaten by that flood dragon. As for her 2 sex sisters, they had died long ago at the hands of that elder from Whitefish Island. There was always an enchanting smile on Su Xinjai's expressive face whenever she appeared from the fox skin beauty talisman. She was the most open-minded and adventurous person out of the 12 female entities staying inside the talismans, and she was the mastermind behind many tricks that were used to tease Zhang Yi. Chen Ping'an truly wouldn't have dared to let her out of the talisman if it weren't for the fact that they were about to enter the jurisdiction of Yellow Barrier Mountain. Regarding the current situation of Yellow Barrier Mountain, Chen Ping'an had already told Su Xinjai everything that he knew. The esteemed master whom she missed dearly had already passed away several years ago, but the current state of Yellow Barrier Mountain was still quite stable. It was only a second-rate immortal force in the Stonebrush Nation, after all, and such middling forces were surprisingly able to avoid the catastrophic flames of war with relative ease. Third-tier and weaker immortal forces would be annexed and gobbled up by stronger neighboring forces, while top-notch first-rate forces would easily attract attention and trouble due to their size and strength. These powerful forces were given a huge headache regarding how they should deal with the imperial court of the Stonebrush Nation or the heavy cavalry of the Greatly Empire. One mistake, and they could invite destructive flames of fury onto themselves. There were 30 or so cultivators in Yellow Barrier Mountain, with all of them being official immortals who were registered with the necessary departments. Add to that the servants and subordinates, and there were approximately 200 people in Yellow Barrier Mountain right now. Su Xinjai's final wish was to return to Yellow Barrier Mountain and offer 3 sticks of incense to both her master's grave and the ancestral hall. She had no other wish beyond this. In fact, she didn't even wish to remain in the Hall of the Underworld or the imitation-colored glazed pagoda. Su Xinjai surprisingly didn't tease Zhang Yi or bookkeeper Chen Ping'an when she appeared this time. Zhang Yi found this strange, while Chen Ping'an wasn't surprised at all. She was returning home with complicated feelings. Zhang Yi felt quite happy to see Su Xinjai. His thoughts and feelings were pure and limpid. Chen Ping'an was aware of his feelings, and Su Xinjai was aware of them as well. However, she pretended to be oblivious to them. Compared to more mature women, younger women relied more on love at first sight when entering relationships. Men were enchanted by a woman's beauty, while women were attracted to a man's handsomeness. This was an unbreakable rule that needn't be met with any surprise. The pitiful Zhang Yi was faring slightly better than the Vermilion Court residence's Ma Yuanji, but only by a negligible amount that truly wouldn't make any difference. Chen Ping'an changed his plans upon seeing Su Xinjai's knitted brows and worried expression, telling Zhang Yi to sleep for 2 or so hours after he finished cultivation. They would then continue to travel through the night. This was a rare opportunity for Zhang Yi to do something for Su Xinjai, so he naturally patted his chest loudly and agreed without hesitation. Chen Ping'an couldn't help but smack his forehead upon seeing this. Zhang Yi was a fledgling who had seldom interacted with young women, after all. Even so, Chen Ping'an still gave Zhang Yi an opportunity, walking away by himself and leaving Su Xinjai at the campfire to act as a temporary Dao guardian for the cultivating Zhang Yi. Chen Ping'an secretly left his 2 flying swords at the campfire before walking along the small mountain path on the mountain ridge where the thick snow and pine leaves would occasionally crackle and crunch underfoot. Turning around and glancing back, he saw Su Xinjai holding the hems of her dress and quickly running over, purposely causing her footsteps to be as loud as possible, and leaving a long trail of footsteps in her wake. Her ability to do this wasn't because she was an abode tier cultivator while alive. Rather, it was quite easy to achieve this using the extraordinarily expensive foxskin beauty talismans crafted by Light Breeze City's Sioux clan. There were all manners of weird and wonderful things in the vast world. As cultivators ascended step by step and gazed around, they would eventually be able to witness more magnificent views than those at the foot of the mountains. Su Xinjai arrived beside Chen Ping'an, walking side by side with him and saying with a smile, "Mr. Chen is truly bad at matchmaking. Can't you tell that I have zero interest in Xingyi, that silly young boy?" Chen Ping'an smiled wryly and replied, "It's okay if you don't like him, and it's not as if I'll force you to do anything against your will. However, you shouldn't purposely make him feel sad either. Miss Su will be comfortable and carefree in the future, but I still need to interact with that silly young boy for several more years." Su Xinjai feigned astonishment, smiling with squinted eyes and exclaiming, "A great immortal like Mr. Chen actually cares about the feelings of a silly young boy like him? You should give him a beating if he isn't obedient. You should beat him until he submits. Cultivators from Bamboo Scroll Lake are all, we don't remember kindness, and we only remember beatings." Chen Ping'an chuckled in anger and replied, "I'm this close to ignoring you." Su Xinjai suddenly extended an arm and tried to loop it around Chen Ping'an's elbow, yet Chen Ping'an hurriedly jumped away and shot a glare at her, asking, "You really want a beating?" Su Xinjai covered her mouth and giggled. She then bent down and made a snowball, asking casually, "Mr. Chen, where's the small charcoal basket that you always bring around? I can help you light it up." Chen Ping'an shook his head and said, "We shouldn't waste any charcoal. It was fine at Cyan Gorge Island, and there was naturally someone to replenish my stock of charcoal once I finished using them. However, there's no such thing here, so I'll need to spend my own money to buy charcoal from the markets. My hands will be warm, but my heart will be aching." Even though Su Xinjai had appeared in the living world many times during the course of the journey, allowing her to witness bookkeeper Chen's miserly nature from the very beginning, she still found this aspect of Chen Ping'an very fresh and interesting. It was for the sake of hearing this answer that she had asked the question in the first place. Su Xinjai walked in front of Chen Ping'an before suddenly walking in reverse and giggling. "When we arrive at Yellow Barrier Mountain, Mr. Chen definitely has to eat some crispy mahua on Osmantha Street that's located in the small town at the foot of the mountain. When only by eating this mahua will this trip have been worthwhile. In fact, it's best if you buy a large bag and bring it with you. Are you going to pay?" Chen Ping'an asked with a huff. Su Xinjai rolled her eyes and exclaimed, "Oh my, what might the problem be, Mr. Chen, old immortal Chen? You've especially traveled all this way already, yet you're still worried about a few taels of silver." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "It's quite clear that you're a young lady who doesn't know how to save up and spend responsibly, yet you still dare to look down on the honest and responsible Zhang Yi?" Su Xinjai was extremely irritated, so she immediately threw the snowball in her hand at Chen Ping'an. The latter bent his knees slightly and easily dodged the attack. Su Xinjai was just about to make another snowball, yet Chen Ping'an hurriedly said, "Stop, stop, stop. I don't want Zhang Yi to develop any misunderstanding about the two of us." Sure enough, Su Xinjai stopped her movements and remarked in amusement, "Perhaps Mr. Chen has seen incredible beauties before, so I can no longer interest you? Or perhaps you're interested, but you don't dare to act on your feelings." Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and replied, "This isn't something that should be revealed to others." Su Xinjai looked into the young man's eyes before making a face and exclaiming, "Wow, wow, wow, what a surprise! As it turns out, our blockhead Mr. Chen genuinely has a girl whom he likes. Ah drat, it looks like I've lost another bet." Chen Ping'an merely smiled and offered no response. In the end, Chen Ping'an told Su Xinjai to go back to where Xingyi was first, saying that he was still going to walk around for a while. Su Xinjai joked that Chen Ping'an was a sly old fox even though he was so young, and it was hard to say how many young ladies had fallen victim to him for him to become so very meticulous. Chen Ping'an accepted this as a word of praise, not arguing with Su Xinjai's remark. Su Xinjai walked back to where Xingyi was and squatted down beside the campfire. Chen Ping'an didn't return for a long time. There was a giddy smile on Xingye's face when he finished cultivating and saw Su Xinjai squatting beside him. The three of them set off again when Chen Ping'an eventually returned. Chen Ping'an didn't retrieve the other foxskin beauty talismans because they were approaching the territory of an immortal force, And this decision was consistent with what he had generally done when passing mountain god temples, river god temples, city god pavilions, scholarly temples, and martial sage temples in the past. In reality, being in possession of a guest elder jade tablet from Cyan Gorge Island meant that Chan Ping'an could have simply ignored the small problems that he might have encountered. Moreover, the Stonebrush Nation was in very close vicinity to Bamboo Scroll Lake, where there were many vagrant cultivators, so the citizens of this nation were largely accustomed to all sorts of things that people in other small nations might find astonishing or inconceivable. Even so, Chan Ping'an insisted on his decision of not retrieving the fox skin beauty talismans. Su Xinjai and the other femaline entities simply grumbled a little, and it didn't seem like they were actually complaining for real. Instead, it was as if they were pouting to their guardian. It was evening when the one ghost and two people arrived at the small town located at the foot of Yellow Barrier Mountain. Even though Chan Ping'an said earlier that he was reluctant to spend money, he still bought a bag of the most expensive mahua from Osmanthus Street. The mahua came in assorted flavors, and Chan Ping'an shared them with Su Xinjai and Zengyi. They were indeed fragrant and crispy, and after taking a few bites, Chan Ping'an surprisingly turned around to buy 2 additional large bags, secretly placing them inside his minimization treasure when no one was looking. He pretended not to see Su Xinjai's wide smile. There were 2 cultivators guarding the entrance of Yellow Barrier Mountain, one old and one young, with both being lower 5-tier disciples with relatively poor cultivation aptitude. When Chan Ping'an retrieved the guest elder jade tablet from Cyan Gorge Island, which was brimming with spiritual energy, and briefly explained the reason for his visit, the 2 cultivators immediately turned pale with fright and showed no signs of wanting to report the matter first. Instead, they directly led Chan Ping'an and his companions into the mountain. Chan Ping'an didn't conceal Su Xinjai's identity to Yellow Barrier Mountain, nor did he purposely keep secret the 2 other matters. The old cultivator remembered Su Xinjai's name, especially since she was once a profound talent whom Yellow Barrier Mountain had very high hopes for. However, tragedy had struck, and Yellow Barrier Mountain never even considered condemning the culprit. Rather, they had voluntarily sent someone to Bamboo Scroll Lake's Whitefish Island to apologize to that Dragon Gate tier immortal. Of course, Yellow Barrier Mountain had wanted to turn this misfortune into fortune, hoping that they could forge some sort of relationship with Whitefish Island. That way, they could lean on this relationship to deter the adversarial immortal forces, both close and far. However, Whitefish Island had refused to grant the cultivator from Yellow Barrier Mountain an audience, not giving them any face at all. Fortunately, that cultivator had purposely explained things in an ambiguous manner after returning, thereby bringing some tangible benefits to Yellow Barrier Mountain. With this in mind, would the old cultivator dare to slight the unexpected visitor, a guest elder from Cyan Gorge Island? The old ancestor of Yellow Barrier Mountain quickly walked out from his residence, bringing with him several important cultivators from the immortal force. He personally made his way over to welcome the incredibly lofty guest elder Chan. Of the 1,000 or so islands in Bamboo Scroll Lake, and of the tens of thousands of unrestrained vagrant cultivators, the Stonebrush Nation needed to firmly keep in mind the name of 100 or so islands. Among these 100 or so islands, they needed to sear into their memory the names of a dozen or so large islands, including Azure Mound Island, Millet Grain Island, Heavenly Governess Island, and so on. As for Cyan Gorge Island, which was controlled by the river-severing True Lord, a nascent tier cultivator, this was essentially the highest peak of the mountain, one that housed the loftiest of terrestrial immortals. Yellow Barrier Mountain had no way of knowing about the tumultuous events that had swept through Bamboo Scroll Lake during the past 2 months, but apart from those ill-informed and secluded low-level immortal forces, almost all of the cultivators in the Stonebrush Nation had heard about Lu Jimao successfully ascending the throne and becoming the ruler of Bamboo Scroll Lake. Tears welled up in Su Xinjai's eyes when she saw the familiar old ancestor of Yellow Barrier Mountain, and she immediately fell to her knees before breaking down into sobs. The old ancestor and the other cultivators of Yellow Barrier Mountain were given a huge fright. Chan Ping'an spoke tactfully and repeated to them what he had said to the 2 cultivators guarding the entrance of the mountain. These explanations were all thought up by Su Xinjai herself. Chan Ping'an was simply repeating what Su Xinjai had told him to say. After learning of the truth, everyone in Yellow Barrier Mountain felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off their shoulders. After they sat down, the sea observation tier-old ancestor who was still unable to advance to the Dragon Gate tier after all these years started to ask Su Xinjai, who had a completely different appearance from before, how she was doing. There was some sense of sincerity in his words, and this wasn't something that could be faked. The cultivators from Yellow Barrier Mountain also sighed with emotion when they saw how much Su Xinjai treasured the past. Afterward, Su Xinjai visited the ancestral hall of the immortal force to respectfully offer 3 sticks of incense. In fact, it was the old ancestor of Yellow Barrier Mountain who personally handed her the incense sticks. In the end, Su Xinjai went to her master's grave with only Qian Ping'an and Xingyi accompanying her. She politely turned down the offer for Yellow Barrier Mountain's old ancestor and the several other cultivators to accompany her. Looking at the disappearing figures of the 3 people, a middle-aged cultivator couldn't help but sigh with emotion. This guest elder Qian, who's come from the distant Cyan Gorge Island, a person truly can't be judged by their appearance. The old ancestor of Yellow Barrier Mountain smiled and said, "What are you trying to say? Are you praising him or belittling him? Thank heavens guest elder Qian isn't here, or else your comment could have brought great trouble to our small Yellow Barrier Mountain." However, the old ancestor immediately stroked his beard and chuckled. In any case, it's genuinely true that people can't be judged by their appearance. His appearance is normal, and he's not carrying a single dazzling immortal treasure on him. If it weren't for that guest elder jade tablet, it would have been exceedingly difficult to believe that such a young cultivator is already a high-ranking guest elder at Cyan Gorge Island. How impressive! Compared to him, we're nothing more than a bunch of good-for-nothing old bones. We can't compare at all. Before the middle-aged cultivator could say anything else, the old ancestor shot a glance at him and shook his head lightly, saying, "Things are going swimmingly, so is there any need for Yellow Barrier Mountain to do anything extra? Perhaps we're not satisfied enough with how well things are going, so we decide to gild the lily out of boredom." The middle-aged cultivator immediately nodded in understanding. Even though they had already walked far away, Su Xinjai still astutely noticed the look of exasperation on Qian Ping'an's face. She smiled and asked, "What's wrong? Is the old ancestor saying something about me behind my back?" "No, they're just praising me." Qian Ping'an shook his head and replied with a chuckle. "What are they saying?" Su Xinjai asked in curiosity. "It's passable if they're praising Mr. Qian as young and accomplished, so Mr. Qian can wholeheartedly accept this praise. But if they're praising Mr. Qian as handsome and extraordinary in demeanor, please don't believe their nonsense." Sure enough, only like-minded people join the same immortal force. Cultivators in Yellow Barrier Mountain all think and act the same way, Qian Ping'an said in helplessness. Su Xinjai smiled in response. She walked very slowly afterward. Qian Ping'an also slowed down. There was a relatively beautiful area at the back of the Yellow Barrier Mountain, though the spiritual energy here was far thinner than that on Cyan Gorge Island. They stood in front of a grave. Su Xinjai offered 3 sticks of incense and kowtowed to pay respects to her late master. She was unwilling to stand up for a long time. Qian Ping'an squatted down in the distance and casually picked up a small handful of soil, gently squeezing it in his hand. Xingyi gazed at Su Xinjai from a distance, feeling a shared sense of sadness as he did so. After Su Xinjai eventually stood up, she wiped the tears from her face before walking over to Qian Ping'an. There was relief on her face, and her brows were no longer knitted in a melancholy frown. Qian Ping'an tossed the soil away and stood back up. Su Xinjai smiled faintly and said, "Mr. Qian, you can put the talisman away now." Qian Ping'an wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. In the end, he remained silent and placed the fox-skin beauty talisman back inside his sleeve. Standing in front of him was the female entity who had reverted to her original appearance. "Are you sure you don't want to live in the fox-skin beauty talisman anymore?" Qian Ping'an asked. "You don't want to live in it even if there's the heavenly worship ceremony, the liberation rite of water and land, a means for better reincarnation, or..." Su Xinjai shook her head before Qian Ping'an could finish, interrupting him and saying, "I have no regrets, not a single one." She took several steps back and smiled beautifully as she performed a graceful curtsy to the bookkeeper, who was no less pale than entities. Su Xinjai turned around and smiled at the teary Xingyi, saying, "Silly young boy. Remember to cultivate earnestly with Mr. Qian in the future." Make sure to advance to the middle 5 tiers and become an earth immortal. Zheng Yi nodded earnestly in response. Su Xinzhai then turned to Chen Ping'an and said in a soft voice, "May all of Mr. Chen's wishes come true, and may Mr. Chen Ping'an be free from all worries." "You don't want to reconsider?" Chen Ping'an asked in a hoarse voice. "May Mr. Chen become immortal Dao partners with the girl whom you like," Su Xinzhai finished. Chen Ping'an took a deep breath and cupped his fists in farewell, saying, "May fate let us cross paths again in the future." Tears streamed down Su Xinzhai's face, yet she was smiling happily as she requested, "Mr. Chen, please make sure to recognize me at that time. Okay?" Chen Ping'an nodded lightly in response. Su Xinzhai cocked her head slightly and gazed at the young man's eyes, seemingly wanting to confirm that he wasn't lying. In the end, she smiled widely and remarked, "Ha! I just realized that our Mr. Chen is actually very handsome." Chen Ping'an squeezed out a smile, shakily raising a thumb and replying, "This young lady has quite decent taste." With no more regrets and attachments, Su Xinzhai's soul started to fade away bit by bit, making her appear like a beautiful lady in a painting that was burning to ashes and scattering in the wind, ultimately returning to the embrace of heaven and earth. Chen Ping'an waved goodbye to her. Zheng Yi covered his face and sobbed. In the end, Chen Ping'an patted the young boy's shoulder and said, "Let's go." Zheng Yi nodded softly and hung his head in dejection. "If you truly like Miss Su that much, it doesn't matter even if you were eventually unable to express your feelings to her in the end," Chen Ping'an said in a quiet voice. "In the next tens upon hundreds of years, you need to find her again and loudly confess your feelings, even if this means scouring the entire world. If 100 years isn't enough, then you need to work hard and strive to become an earth immortal, competing with heaven and earth to see who has a longer lifespan. If you still like her at that time, what does it matter that you travel far and wide for thousands of years to look for her while cultivating earnestly at the same time?" Zheng Yi suddenly looked up and said through sobs, "But my cultivation aptitude is bad." Chen Ping'an's voice became solemn as he scolded, "Zheng Yi, before you've put in effort that far exceeds ordinary people, you don't have any right to claim that your aptitude is bad or that you lack talent. I don't care if you say this 1,000 times or 10,000 times to other people, but I don't want to hear it a second time if you want to keep cultivating with me." Zheng Yi was slightly dazed as he listened to Chen Ping'an's rebuke. Chen Ping'an walked forward first, saying to Zheng Yi, "I'll wait for you at the entrance of the mountain. Before that, I'll bid farewell to the cultivators of Yellow Barrier Mountain, and you don't need to come along with me for this. You can stay here by yourself, and it's up to you whether you speak the thoughts in your mind or not. It won't make any difference. It's whether you can genuinely remember and cherish Miss Su that will be the best proof of your feelings for her. However, let me say something that you might not want to hear right now. I won't hold you in lower regard even if you end up liking another girl in a few months or several years. If you can genuinely remember Miss Su for as long as you live, however, then I'll definitely hold you, Zheng Yi, in higher regard." Chen Ping'an left Zheng Yi by himself, returning to the other side of the mountain to thank the cultivators of Yellow Barrier Mountain and bid farewell to them. He then slowly descended the mountain. Reaching the bottom, he sat on the steps at the mountain entrance to wait for Zheng Yi. Turning around and looking up, he saw a tall and sturdy young boy sprinting down the mountain. Located on Pine and Crane Street, a street where many officials and nobles from one of the Stonebrush Nation's provincial city lived, there was the residence of the Ma clan, which had an incredibly tall door threshold. It had already been a top-notch clan to begin with, yet its standing was elevated even further thanks to the birth of a daughter who was even more precious than royal family members. The Ma clan was extremely renowned in the provincial city, and even the proud and haughty governor would make sure to send some subordinates over whenever it was the new year or there was a festival. The new year was around the corner, and the clip-clop of hooves reverberated down the blue stone slabs of the wide street in the morning. 3 steeds had entered the city and arrived at Pine and Crane Street very early in the day. The flames of war were tearing through the Stonebrush Nation, and now this omen of destruction had spread to the central region of the nation, only 1 province away from the province in which Pine and Crane Street was located. The street was no longer as lively and full of joyful celebrations as the previous years. The 3 people dismounted their horses. One was a listless young man wearing an azure cotton robe and carrying both a saber and a sword like those wanderers. He was accompanied by a male and a female, with the former being a tall and sturdy young boy carrying a bamboo case and the latter being a lithe young woman who was unfortunately wearing a veiled hat. The steward of the Ma clan was a middle-aged man dressed no less fancy than a noble from the prefectural cities, and he let out a yawn as he shot a sideways glance at the young outsider standing at the forefront of the three people. He felt slightly impatient, but he immediately shuddered and became wide awake after hearing that the young man had come from Bamboo Scroll Lake Cyan Gorge Island. He hastily lowered his head and bowed, asking the esteemed immortals to wait for a moment as he went to inform the clan leader of their arrival. As the steward ran off, he didn't forget to turn around with a smile and kindly request the esteemed immortals to wait patiently. He would definitely return as soon as possible. The Ma clan's residence was large, and the profusely sweating steward returned to the entrance after 6 or 7 minutes. Hurriedly walking beside him was a skinny and refined man with graying sideburns. Walking in a slow and unhurried manner behind the two of them was an old man who looked like the teacher of a private school. The young woman wearing the veiled hat was on the verge of tears, yet she bit her lips tight and didn't make a single sound. Qian Ping'an retrieved his jade tablet and handed it to the old man, who carefully examined both the front side and back side. He then respectfully returned the jade tablet to Qian Ping'an and said in a quiet voice, "I didn't foresee this esteemed guest elder's visit, so please forgive me for the improper welcome." The clan leader of the Ma clan suppressed his delight, respect, and apprehension and quickly invited the 3 guests from the faraway Cyan Gorge Island into his residence. The clan leader initially wanted to give his guests a ceremonious welcome to express his sincerity, but the young immortal walking in front politely declined his offer. According to what he had discussed with the precious daughter of the Ma clan who had once brought immense honor and glory to her clan, Qian Ping'an frankly said to the clan leader, who was healthy even as he approached 50, back at Bamboo Scroll Lake, Madi was initially a cultivator on Pine Wind Island, cultivating in an immortal force led by an old cultivator called Xiao Dongtian. She had no hope of attaining the Great Tao at that time, but she came across another fated opportunity later, and genuinely entered the proper path of cultivation. She was fortunate enough to join my lineage, and she can be regarded as a junior niece of mine now. This is the reason why I've especially come to visit the Ma clan this time. Qian Ping'an was the guest. Yet his words were very firm and arguably impolite, with his haughty manner extremely fitting for his identity as a cultivator from Bamboo Scroll Lake. His tone was also consistent with that of top-notch official immortals from the mountains of the Stonebrush Nation. However, the clan leader and the guest elder of the Ma clan found this completely reasonable and expected. Otherwise, they would have genuinely started to question the veracity of the young man's claim. Perhaps he was an imposter trying to act as a guest elder from Bamboo Scroll Lake to take advantage of the Ma clan's currently precarious situation and trick them? If that were the case, the Ma clan would at most treat their guests to good food and good drink and serve them well for a period of time before hurriedly seeing them off. Doing so would be for the sake of reducing risks, lest they invite any more troubles onto themselves. After all, what the Ma clan needed right now was tangible help in a dire time. They didn't need anyone to gild the lily. Even though they were still slightly skeptical of the young man's identity as a so-called guest elder of Cyan Gorge Island, they ultimately believed it more than they doubted it. Thus, they became increasingly polite toward their guests, so much so that they were bordering on being obsequious. In any case, speaking bucket-loads of polite words wouldn't cost them a single silver coin. The Ma clan hadn't become so powerful and wealthy today, simply by relying on their ancestors and descendants studying sagely texts. The only trouble was that the Ma clan had been enjoying far too much fame and doing business with far too many people during the past few decades. They wanted to earn as much money as they could. Yet what they eventually earned was very big trouble. The Ma clan wasn't afraid of spending silver to resolve troubles, and what they feared was spending huge sums of money, but not receiving any life-saving talismans to quash the troubles. They feared that they might receive a death-accelerating talisman instead. However, things would truly take a turn for the best if this person were genuinely Ma Dui's new senior. There was huge commotion throughout the Stonebrush Nation right now, and from the capital to the regions, the words of a decently powerful immortal were far more effective than the words of the pitiful officials belonging to the 6 ministries. Qian Ping'an maintained his frankness and conciseness after entering the main hall of the Ma clan's residence, saying that he had a fairly good relationship with Ma Dui, so he could do his best to provide some minor help to the Ma clan if they encountered any troubles. Since the Ma clan was doing quite well right now, he could see if the clan had any members who had good cultivation aptitude. If someone were truly fortunate enough, they could decide in the future whether they wanted to go to Bamboo Scroll Lake to cultivate or whether they wanted to stay and receive some immortal coins instead. The 3 steeds left the provincial city 3 days after they arrived. The young woman who had been wearing a veiled hat the entire time glanced back at the city walls of the provincial city, a complicated look in her eyes. The Ma clan's imminent trouble was peacefully solved following the appearance of the young guest elder from Cyan Gorge Island, as well as a trip to the governor's manor. A young child from the Ma clan who had the aptitude to reach the 4th or 5th tier started to cultivate with an old immortal in the provincial city. He wasn't an unofficial disciple, but rather a legitimate in-house disciple who needed to clearly record his name on the records of the imperial court. This signified that as long as the child remained the disciple of a renowned cultivator, the Ma clan would receive another endless stream of immortal coins. Of course, the child's master wouldn't use all of the immortal coins he received to pave a path for his disciple, but no matter what, it could be said that the child no longer needed to worry about other matters. The child would definitely receive some tangible benefits that belonged to themselves. Chun Ping'an didn't say anything as he rode his horse. Even Zhang Yi, someone who was relatively slow when it came to interpersonal matters, noticed the lack of familial care displayed by the clan leader and his wife toward their daughter Ma Dui during his several days visiting the Ma clan. They carefully asked about this and that, inquiring about Ma Dui's relationship with her master and force, asking about her cultivation base, and subtly probing whether the young guest elder from Cyan Gorge Island had a Dao partner yet. Simply put, Ma Dui's parents only asked 1 or 2 surface-level questions about her sudden transition from a cultivator at Pinewind Island to a cultivator at Cyan Gorge Island. However, just like the conversations and small talk that took place in banquets and official dinners, these questions were nothing more than necessary topics that held little actual importance. These questions were simply asked to refrain from appearing too uncaring and vulgar. The relationship between Ma Dui and her parents was now very distant. Perhaps Ma Dui had left home for too many years, with her lack of cultivation talent greatly disappointing her old ancestor. She was only able to reach the 5th tier, and she could never manage to leave Bamboo Scroll Lake to return home and visit her clan, so due to the great distance between Ma Dui and her parents, perhaps they felt like her newfound status was vastly different and too lofty now. Or perhaps their clan was blessed with many descendants and children who were always running around and having fun beside them, so they naturally felt more attached to these children than their daughter who had traveled far away. There might be tens upon hundreds of reasons, but there was only a single reality. No matter what an outsider said right now, their words would only be like a knife slicing through Ma Dui's heart. It would cause nothing but pain. Thus, Chun Ping'an used his eyes to warn Zhang Yi during one of their breaks, telling the young boy to keep his mouth shut and not splurt out the words of consolation that he could barely keep in anymore. Chun Ping'an didn't put away the foxskin beauty talisman that Ma Dui was residing in, allowing her to ride with them to the next destination and clear her mind. 2 days passed, and the expression in Xingye's eyes started to change. His appearance and voice remained unchanged, but a person's eyes were a gateway to their soul. As such, a person's eyes could greatly influence the way in which they were perceived by others. Ma Dui finally extracted herself from her state of despondency, most likely due to the fact that she found Xingye's current state quite interesting. The soul of an errand worker from Cyan Gorge Island was starting to possess Xingye's body, and this process was slightly different from that of inviting the possession of deities and opening the door to welcome spirits, techniques that ordinary vagrant cultivators were skilled at. As for the specifics of Xingye's technique, Ma Dui naturally couldn't discern anything. They approached a village in the countryside. They saw a hunchbacked old woman wearing simple and clean clothes, with the clothes not appearing tattered even though there were some patches. She was returning from the stream after washing some clothes, limping slowly as she carried a large bamboo basket in her arms. This was no easy task for an elderly villager such as her. One would face many hardships in one's life, and making few complaints despite a simple and hard life was already very difficult. To those living in poverty, the thought of living like a wealthy person seemed as difficult as ascending the heavens. However, wanting to live a comfortable and carefree life was even harder. Zhang Yi jumped off his horse, stumbling as he sprinted over to the old woman. After arriving in front of her, He immediately fell to his knees and loudly kowtowed. The old woman was at a complete loss, and she hurriedly put down her bamboo basket, not having any time to care about the clothes that she had just washed and whether they would collect any mud. She bent down with some difficulty and tried to help the unfamiliar young boy up, and she frantically asked in a local dialect that Chan Ping'an and Madi couldn't understand, "What are you doing? What are you doing? There's no need for this. Oh, there's no need for this." There was an additional fox skin beauty in the old woman's room, yet residing inside this body was actually the soul of a man. On the table was a pile of immortal coins that Chan Ping'an had left behind before leaving, with enough spiritual energy to last him 20 years. This was enough time to look after the old woman and accompany her until her last moments. After the three guests left, the old woman held hands with her grandson, who had already left home for far too long, with both of them shedding tears as they sat opposite each other. 3 horses left along the small path of the village. Zheng Ye's soul was still a little unstable, and he needed to slowly meditate and breathe to remedy this problem. The 3 horses left slowly. Ma Dui suddenly blurted, "That old woman was a good person, but she still shouldn't have spoken to you like that after learning of the truth. It's correct in principle to pay for a life with a life, but what has the misfortune suffered by her grandson got to do with you?" Chan Ping'an shook his head and said, "I feel like she should have said that. It was correct of her to do so." Ma Dui suddenly humped coldly and said with a look of annoyance, "Just look at that, even an old woman from some countryside village cherishes their child more than my cold-hearted parents." Chan Ping'an turned around and asked with a smile, "Are you angered to death? If so, then why don't we return to the provincial city to take the immortal coins back? I can then help you scold your parents. Same rules as before. You draft up what to say, and I'll say them when we get there." Casually riding on her horse, Ma Dui turned to Chan Ping'an and huffed at his suggestion in disgust, replying, "In your dreams." As expected of a bookkeeper who's lost his conscience and always thinks about making money, Chan Ping'an roared with hearty laughter. Ma Dui suddenly smiled and said, "Do you know why my parents chose this name for me? It's because the midwife said with absolute certainty that I was going to be a chubby boy before I was born. However, my father waiting outside the door immediately became stupefied when he heard that I was a girl. He stomped his foot in anger and left, but he eventually returned in an angry and irritated state. My mother often told me about the first time my father saw me. My skin was smooth and jade-like, and I was extremely cute and not ugly like most other babies, so my father immediately laughed in delight when he saw me. Oh, that's right. Do you know why I'm called Ma Dui? I'm asking you a question, Mr. Chan." Chan Ping'an smiled and shook his head. Ma Dui bobbed her head around like those teachers whom she found incredibly annoying during her youth, revealing, "Lofty in talent and diligent in study, proficient in movement and unparalleled on the path of the great Tao. How wonderful." Shouldn't it be unparalleled in the world? Chan Ping'an asked. Ma Dui clutched her stomach and laughed loudly, replying, "Oh my teacher Chan, you've caught on to my bluff now? Okay, you're the only smart person here," Chan Ping'an said in exasperation. Ma Dui turned around and asked in a gentle voice, "Mr. Chan, why are you helping us?" Chan Ping'an let go of the reins and wrapped his hands behind his head, murmuring, "Yeah, why am I doing this?" Ma Dui dazedly looked at Chan Ping'an's slightly sunken cheeks. This had nothing to do with romantic feelings, and she was simply feeling a little heartbroken for him, so much so that the sadness lingering in her mind was quashed by this feeling. The young man wearing the azure cotton robe clapped his hands and exclaimed, "I've got it!" Ma Dui looked on in curiosity. The bookkeeper with a saber and sword by his waist was smiling widely in a rare display, and he exclaimed, "How wonderful! It's because it feels wonderful." Ma Dui also smiled upon hearing this, but she stubbornly said, "What kind of bullshit answer is this?" Chan Ping'an placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves and warned, "If you continue to grumble and complain, be careful that I summon you back into the talisman." Ma Dui wasn't afraid at all, completely ignoring Chan Ping'an's threat as she asked, "Where's our next destination?" Chan Ping'an smiled and squinted his eyes as he gazed into the distance, quietly murmuring, "It's definitely going to be in the living world. How wonderful!" Ma Dui suddenly exclaimed in a loud voice, "Indeed!" Chan Ping'an smiled and concurred. The clip-clopping hooves gradually traveled further and further away from the sound of chickens and dogs in the countryside village. The final and heaviest snowfall of the year arrived without warning. Late one snowy and windy night, they were already far, far away from the countryside village. Madui was an entity, so she wasn't afraid of the heavy snow at all. She was extremely relaxed and carefree as she recited famous poems, remarking that the heavy snow was like soaring gulls, where turning around they could see the gutters, attacking the faces of those who ventured out of their village. Qian Ping'an looked around several times as he rode on horseback, attempting to find a place where they could shelter from the wind and snow. He couldn't help but grumble in a chattering voice. How is this wind and snow attacking the face? More like wind and snow trying to freeze people to death. Madui grinned and asked, "How do you feel now, Teacher Qian? Is everything still wonderful?" Qian Ping'an ignored her, shifting from a sitting position to a standing position on horseback, and trying his best to peer into the distance. He finally discovered some vague specks of light at some place in the distance after a while. Qian Ping'an furrowed his brows slightly. The three of them were returning the same way they had come, and Qian Ping'an had quietly memorized all of the places they had passed. This place shouldn't have had any light. Just as Qian Ping'an planned to brave the biting cold to continue forward and take a detour around the light source, he discovered that the specks of light were seemingly moving at a slow speed. If nothing surprising happened, these specks of light would eventually cross paths with the three of them further down the road. Qian Ping'an unexpectedly felt at ease upon realizing this. To lock onto them from such a great distance and to move in advance in anticipation of their encounter, these people most likely weren't bandits or thieves. Thus, he didn't need to worry as much if they were truly vagrant cultivators or spirits and ghosts. Heaven and earth were vast, and there were times when staying alive wasn't easy at all. However, seeking death would always be very easy. Madui was slightly worried when she finally noticed the lights in the distance. "Mr. Qian, should we take a detour around them?" she asked in a quiet voice. "There's no need," Qian Ping'an replied calmly. Madui faltered upon hearing this. Madui had most likely grown accustomed to Qian Ping'an's agreeable nature after they left Bamboo Scroll Lake. So it was only at this moment that she recalled that Mr. Qian would be more stubborn and disagreeable than anyone else if he felt the need to be stubborn and disagreeable. The two parties were going to encounter each other on a narrow path. In the distance was a group of 30 or so light cavalry, and they slowly came to a stop with their bows and sabers gleaming with especially vigorous might in the heavy snow. Approximately half of the cavalrymen were carrying torches in one hand, and the several men at the forefront of the group weren't wearing standard armor like everyone else as they clustered around and protected a handsome young man. The handsome young man was wearing a snow-white fox fur coat, and he squinted his eyes to peer through the wind and snow and observe the three riders in the distance. Appearing elegant and noble, he pursed his thin and sanguine lips. Three subordinates came to a stop beside the handsome young man. To his left was a burly man holding a long and brilliant lance that gleamed under the radiance of the torches held by the cavalrymen behind them. There was also a skinny and monkey-like man with his arms crossed before his chest. He had neither bow nor saber, and there was no sword hanging by his waist either. However, there were several bloody and ice-cold heads hanging on both sides of his saddle. To the right of the handsome young man was only a single person, an expressionless man in his 40s who was carrying a sword in a pine-grain scabbard, with the hilt of the sword surprisingly shaped like a Ganoderma. The man frequently covered his mouth to cough. The handsome young man appeared to have the closest relationship with the middle-aged man to his right, with his body leaning ever so slightly toward him even though he was sitting high up on horseback. After covering his mouth and coughing again, the middle-aged swordsman glanced at the three steeds approximately 50 paces away and said in a quiet voice, "Your Highness, it's just like I said before, there are indeed two people and one ghost. The ghost is a beautiful woman wearing a fox fur coat, and it's extremely likely that she's a fox skin beauty talisman crafted using the secret technique of Light Breeze City's Sioux clan." The middle-aged swordsman reached forward, appearing as if he wanted to catch some snowflakes. However, a small spirit that measured 1 finger tall surprisingly appeared in his palm. The spirit was snow-white with a pair of wings on its back, with its appearance allowing it to merge with the snow and become hard to detect even from such a close distance. This spirit was presumably a so-called immortal scout, and its purpose was similar to that of immortal observation techniques. It was just that one relied on immortal techniques while one relied on living spirits. "Thanks for your hard work," the middle-aged swordsman said to the small spirit with a smile. He retrieved an exquisite blue and white porcelain jar from his sleeve, slowly putting it back after the small spirit flew inside. The handsome young man whom the middle-aged swordsman had referred to as Your Highness raised an eyebrow, a fervent look in his eyes as he leaned even closer to the former and chuckled. "Mr. Zhang, I've heard of Light Breeze City's Su clan before, but my mother Empress was always reluctant to let me leave the capital and manage another jurisdiction. Things have been delayed for 8 entire years, and I often stay in my residence in the capital all year round. For the sake of avoiding suspicion and also in order to save some ink money for those imperial censors at the censorate, I've never had the opportunity to interact with any immortals from the mountains. What's a foxskin beauty talisman and what's so unique about it?" Mr. Zhang possesses profound knowledge and has traveled around half of the continent before, so can you please explain this to me? While the handsome young man was speaking, Mr. Zhang had already taken out a porcelain vial and poured 2 pea-sized emerald green alchemical pills into his palms, gently popping them into his mouth. His body was most likely struggling against the assault of the wind and snow, and the color only returned to his face after he ingested the pills. Even so, there was still a smile on his face as he replied, "The Su clan is in possession of a 1,000-year-old fox den where an old fox lives. The old fox formed an alliance with the Su clan, agreeing to offer several sheets of fox fur every year. These sheets of fox fur range from 100 years to 300 years old, and they're used to craft talismans that are sold to people all over the eastern treasured Vile continent. These foxskin beauty talismans are incredibly popular in more than half of the continent, and most immortal forces that have immortal coins to spare have several foxskin beauties working as maidservants. Foxskin beauties are no different from ordinary living people after being released from the talisman, and one can even place entities or ghosts inside these talismans. This is most likely the case for that female ghost over there. If an immortal force has a good relationship with Light Breeze City's Su clan, they can even send over an illustration of what they desire the woman to look like before purchasing a foxskin beauty talisman. The Su clan will then craft the talisman according to this illustration, and the guest elders who are responsible for this process are all artistic masters who have never disappointed their customers before." A look of realization appeared on the handsome young man's face, with his eyes becoming increasingly fervent and lustful as he gazed at the female ghost in the distance. Even though he hadn't abided by the ancestral rules and left the capital to rule over his own jurisdiction after all these years, he hadn't wasted his time in the capital either. His biggest hobby was to leave the prison that had produced 2 emperors before, disguising himself as a despondent scholar who had failed to pass the imperial examination or a wanderer from foreign lands who had traveled to the capital. He had already tasted all kinds of beautiful women before, especially the female family members of the imperial censors. He had captured both the hearts and bodies of those who were slightly better looking. Thus, he was even able to casually flip through the numerous impeachment reports that flew into the censorate like snowflakes. He couldn't help this. Even though the imperial family appeared strict and terrifying, they would also dote and pamper their youngest. In any case, his mother Empress' power and influence were quite impressive as well, allowing her to have significant control over the emperor. When the 3 of them gathered in private, the emperor wouldn't feel ashamed even if his mother Empress blatantly teased him and called him someone who only liked to listen to praise, and he would instead laugh heartily. This being the case, he was genuinely unworried about those impeachment reports that he read to pass time. In fact, he would feel utterly ashamed if he weren't scolded by that bunch of old bastards. However, he couldn't help but feel like something was missing from his carefree and comfortable life. He was going to become the emperor in the future, so it was a given that he couldn't become a middle 5-tier immortal. He wouldn't be able to temper his physique and practice fist stances, and he couldn't become a genuine grandmaster in the cultivation world. As for leading an army to go to war and slaughter enemies, he had absolutely no interest in such a matter. The handsome young prince couldn't help but grumble about his mother Empress. The crown prince wasn't him, and even the title of noble king wasn't his. Did his mother truly love him? Or was she purposely treating him as a good-for-nothing and raising him in the capital? She had to remember that his 2 older brothers were bastards born by the former empress. He was in a pitiful state right now. forced to wander around like a homeless dog and forbidden from returning home. Thanks to some excuse from his mother, he could only wander around outside the capital. He had already grown tired of playing around with those unrefined women from the countryside villages, especially since they lacked the skills to properly serve him regardless of how beautiful they were. So be it if this were all, but his mother had even issued an absolute order after he secretly snuck out of the capital, instructing him to personally lead his subordinates to kill scouts from the Great Li Empire. Was this not forcing him to seek death? In reality, he wasn't optimistic about the seemingly powerful but hollow luminous Vermilion Empire, and deep down in his heart, he actually leaned toward surrendering to the powerful northern barbarians from the Great Li Empire. If he were sitting on the royal throne right now, he would immediately open the city gates of the capital and personally lead Su Gaoshan's warhorse inside. What was so fun about war? Of course, he did indeed want to witness a magnificent battle between tens of thousands of qi refiners. Now that would be a true battle between immortals and a glorious sight to behold. But doing battle on horseback? Were they two nests of ants fighting each other? In any case, he was going to reap some decent reward from today's trip. He had come across a beautiful fox skin ghost who appeared no different from ordinary humans. The young prince was absolutely ecstatic. The three steeds in the distance had already stopped for a long time, facing off against his elite cavalrymen just. The young prince's name was Han Jingxin, and he enjoyed the worst reputation out of all royal family members in the imperial court of the Stonebrush Nation. The smile on his face gradually grew wider. The three people in the distance were truly courageous, surprisingly staying put and not obediently retreating to give way to him. This was as expected of a cultivator from the mountains who possessed a fox-skin beauty. He was either an unrestrained vagrant cultivator from Bamboo Scroll Lake or an official immortal from within the Stonebrush Nation, so it was completely understandable that he was young and haughty. However, it was a shame that his status would do him no good in this desolate and uninhabited area. Han Jingxin found it extremely exciting to kill people on windy and snowy nights. The pursuit and battle not long ago had been far too boring, and he had killed an imperial censor who had retired of old age during autumn and made his way south at a snail's pace. The imperial censor's family also had bad seeds, and he hadn't managed to give birth to a single good-looking daughter. Not only that, but even his sons had failed to marry any beautiful women. That being the case, there was no need for Han Jingxin to show any mercy. The imperial censor had always criticized him with such fervor, even dragging the emperor and empress into his criticisms, and somehow earning the esteemed title of courageous official. But this wasn't all, and the old man liked to continue grumbling even after he retired from the officialdom. Not only did he drag his feet and leave slowly, but he even expressed profound criticisms of the current affairs with some renowned literati who were too incapable to become officials. Han Jingxin had nothing better to do, so he had decided to show some filial piety this time, catching up to the convoy of the retired official and personally disemboweling the old man. Han Jingxin's ears had grown calluses after listening to the old man's criticisms for so many years, so he had wanted to personally witness the old man's belly full of complaints. Even so, Han Jingxin still felt like he was far too kind and merciful. After seeing the truly pitiful sight of the old man collapsed in the snow and clutching at his intestines, Han Jingxin had ended his suffering and beheaded him with a single slash of his saber. The old man's head was hanging from the saddle of the skinny and monkey-like martial arts grandmaster right now, remaining silent as they traveled through the wind and snow. Han Jingxin was surprisingly unaccustomed to the silence of the old man. Han Jingxin played with a jade pendant in his hand. This was nothing more than a trinket from the mountains, and it couldn't be regarded as a genuine immortal treasure. Holding it in the hand, however, one would feel warm in winter and cool in summer. It was said that these jade pendants were produced by Dawn Cloud Mountain, and they could be categorized as somewhat passable spirit tools. Han Jingxin raised his empty hand, waving it in the air and gesturing for the three steeds in front of him to move aside. Sure enough, the three horses slowly turned around to make way for him. Han Jingxin was extremely amused by this. There were actually such naive cultivators in the world? Mr. Chun, they don't seem like proper and decent officials and soldiers, Ma Dui warned in a quiet voice. Chun Ping'an nodded in acknowledgement, replying with something that both Ma Dui and Zhang Yi were slightly unaccustomed to. However, His words were a perfect match with the razor-sharp wind and snow tonight. I know they won't relent and let us go, so I'm simply pretending to yield so that they'll be braver when they attack us in a moment. Zheng Ye's expression was stiff, potentially due to the frigid cold or potentially due to Chen Ping'an's words. Chen Ping'an didn't look at the tall and timid young boy, continuing slowly. If we're not strong enough, then we'll be the ones to die in a moment. Ma Dui will suffer the most, and staying alive for her will be even more torturous than death. If you don't understand something this simple, then you should peacefully cultivate in the mountains in the future. You shouldn't travel around the cultivation world. Han Jingxin raised his hand and made another gesture, following which the cavalrymen behind him deftly rode forward. They didn't charge over and attack, however, and they only created a small fan-shaped blocking formation. Their intentions were abundantly clear. They had only been toying with Chen Ping'an and his companions when asking them to move aside just then, and it had been a game of cat and mouse and a small appetizer that had been of little consequence and importance. There was no hurry to bring the starring dish to the table. Zhang Yi, if Ma Dui and I weren't here tonight, and there was only you and Su Xinzhai facing this group of armed cavalry, what would you do? Chen Ping'an suddenly asked. Zhang Yi thought about this for a brief moment before beads of sweat instantly formed on his forehead. Chen Ping'an didn't say anything else. There were some principles that were extremely blunt and unpleasant to the ear. The recipients of these teachings would find it extremely difficult to empathize, especially if they had never encountered such kinds of situations before. Only when they finally suffered hardship would they start to understand. However, it could be said that those who didn't understand these principles were actually fortunate people to begin with. After all, only those who had suffered similar misfortunes before would comprehensively understand these principles without needing anyone to explain it to them. However, this was nothing. There was something that truly terrified Chen Ping'an the more that he thought about it. He discovered that those who were filled with ill intent toward the world appeared to learn more from their hardships than those who were filled with kindness. They committed all of their hardships to memory, and they would even start to mull over how to better interact with people and matters if they suffered small defeats against those who were smarter than them, and failed to obtain wealth that shouldn't have belonged to them in the first place. These ill-intentioned people would carefully think about how to break free from all kinds of difficult situations, how to take advantage of other people's might to suppress their victims, how to achieve victory from a position of weakness, how to harm others to benefit themselves, and how to obtain the power to decide other people's fate if they attain Tao. Chen Ping'an hoped dearly that his observation was wrong. The more wrong it was, the better. Why was it necessary to ask good people to be smarter than bad people? Why was this necessary for them to live a peaceful life? Chen Ping'an exhaled and pointed at the young man in front of the cavalryman, saying to Zheng Yi and Ma Di, "Perhaps the two of you didn't pay attention or didn't have the opportunity to see, but I've seen this person's appearance inside a residence at Bamboo Scroll Lake's Willow Catkin Island. I saw it twice, so I know that his name is Han Jingxin. He's the younger brother of Prince Han Jingling, and the two of them share the same father but a different mother. He's extremely well known in the capital of the Stonebrush Nation, and he's also the favorite son of the Empress of the Stonebrush Nation." Chen Ping'an rubbed his hands together and continued, "I once interacted with two princes who enjoyed similar statuses to Han Jingling and Han Jingxin. They were also brothers, and they hailed from a place called the Great Quan Empire in the Parasol Leaf Continent. However, these two brothers from the Parasol Leaf Continent seemed much smarter than Han Jingling and Han Jingxin. They would at the very least not scheme against other people regardless of whether they were performing good deeds or bad deeds. On the other hand, the youngest prince of the Stonebrush Nation in front of us appears to enjoy clashing head-on." Ma Dui's expression changed slightly. Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and reassured, "There's no need to worry. No one knows your true identity, so you won't bring harm to your clan. Do I need you to tell me this?" Ma Dui huffed. "I'm worried about you biting off more than you can chew and needlessly losing your life here. At that time, you'll screw me over as well and cause me to get kidnapped by that perverted prince." Chen Ping'an naturally knew that Ma Dui was expressing sincere care for his safety and well-being. As for the second half of her final remark, this was most likely as a result of Ma Dui being naturally shy and liking to purposely conceal her kind words, instead transforming them into mean remarks. Chen Ping'an turned around and smiled at her, saying, "From the beginning to the end, I still haven't told the two of you to turn around and flee, right? Zheng Ye's entire mind was filled with Miss Su right now, and he was mulling over the premise that Mr. Chan had mentioned to him just then. How should he deal with such a situation? His thoughts were a complete mess, so chaotic that he didn't catch the implication in Mr. Chen's words. Meanwhile, Ma Dui was an intelligent and considerate young woman. Otherwise, she couldn't have advanced to the abode tier of the middle 5 tiers at such a young age. If it weren't for the calamity that she had faced, and if she hadn't gone crazy and insisted on standing her ground against that fled dragon, perhaps she would have had the potential to slowly advance to the Dragon Gate tier and become a lofty cultivator in Bamboo Scroll Lake. At that time, she could have forged some good relationships with her seniors and the cultivators of the other large islands, allowing her to obtain an island and establish her own force in Bamboo Scroll Lake. Even though Ma Dui understood Chan Ping'an's insinuation, she was still racked with worry as she asked, "Mr. Chan, are you truly going to fight to the death with that prince?" Ma Dui hurriedly added, "I'm not speaking for those cavalrymen, of course, but Bamboo Scroll Lake had never really promoted fighting for the sake of one's emotions. Either one doesn't fight or one completely exterminates their enemies if they fight. What will happen if we engage in a conflict with Han Jingxin here? After all, we still need to travel to the heartland of the Stonebrush Nation afterward, and we still need to visit many provinces and states in the north. Will things become very troublesome? Will this delay Mr. Chen's important tasks?" Chan Ping'an nodded and replied, "I'll act according to the situation. In any case, killing people has never been my goal. However, it seems that Han Jingxin has developed a habit of killing people for fun after leaving the capital, and one of his subordinates even has several heads hanging from his saddle. Some of these heads don't look like they belong to the scouts of the Great Li Empire, so this implies that they definitely aren't being collected as proof to obtain military merit. Rather, they're simply killing people to vent their anger." Chan Ping'an casually drew an imaginary line in the air. Not only was Zheng Yi confused, but even Ma Dui, who had snow accumulating on her shoulders, was completely baffled this time. Chan Ping'an smacked his forehead and said to Ma Dui, I forgot to summon you back into the talisman and put you inside my sleeve." Ma Dui covered her mouth and gave a silvery giggle. Han Jingxin's heart burned with excitement and lust when he saw the charming smile of the beautiful female ghost. He felt like he hadn't suffered in the heavy snow for nothing tonight. He smiled and asked, "Will killing a few cultivators whom we know nothing about cause any trouble for Mr. Zhang?" The middle-aged swordsman shook his head and replied, "Killing cultivators isn't troublesome, and this heavy snowfall can also help us greatly in terms of destroying the corpses and cleaning up the evidence. We just need to take some care. However, the issue is that Your Highness purposely decided against burying the corpses of that convoy a few dozen kilometers away, so it's very easy for observant people to make a connection and grow suspicious of Your Highness. Joining the dots together, Your Highness will be the one facing trouble if those 3 people are genuinely official immortals from a powerful immortal sect or vagrant cultivators from a large island in Bamboo Scroll Lake. With this in mind, there are 3 options in front of Your Highness right now. First, since we've already entered a formation, we should copy those 3 and also take a step back. We can send someone over to discuss matters with that young cultivator, who appears to be recovering from some severe wounds. Your Highness can frankly reveal your identity and say that you want to make a transaction with him, offering money to buy that beautiful ghost. Using one's superior status to suppress others and drive a transaction is the safest and most reliable method. Second, we can brush past each other and pretend that nothing ever happened. In that case, Your Highness will at most lose the opportunity to obtain a beautiful ghost. Third, Your Highness can issue a command for us to charge over and use force. However, we'll need to go back to clean up the corpses of that convoy, lest we leave any traces that cause others to become suspicious. By and large, cultivators from the mountains won't entertain any discourse of reasons and principles once they grow suspicious. Han Jingxin nodded in understanding. He had also come up with these options already, but he had posed the question anyway because he didn't want his subordinates to be full of people who only knew how to fight and kill. He also wanted a subordinate who could think and allow him to speak less. Mr. Zhang was his Mother Empress' trusted subordinate, and she had told Han Jingxin to bring Mr. Zhang with him when he left the capital this time. Sure enough, Mr. Zhang had saved him a boatload of trouble on their journey. Han Jingxin sighed with emotion and remarked sincerely, "It's a true shame that Mr. Zhang isn't a diplomatist. If I have the opportunity to ascend the throne and become emperor in the future, I'll definitely invite Mr. Zhang to become my imperial preceptor. That dog-sit Taoist imperial preceptor that my mother spent a huge sum of money to recruit is nothing more than a useless scammer. Even though my father is not great at dealing with political matters in the imperial court, it's not like he's completely blind and stupid either. It's just that he can't be bothered exposing that Taoist imperial preceptor, instead raising him and treating him as some form of entertainment. At the end of the day, my father's simply wasting some immortal coins instead of silver coins. My father secretly told me that he only needed to spend a few lesser heat coins a year, and he even praised my mother for being outstanding at managing the family and its finances. After all, we simply need to look at the state of affairs pertaining to the imperial preceptors of the other vassal states. These imperial preceptors will definitely revolt in anger if they aren't paid several grain rain coins a year. The skinny and monkey-like martial arts grandmaster was already filled with impatience, and he laughed loudly and exclaimed, "We can just go ahead and kill that ghost-raising person. As for that relatively rare and valuable fox-skin beauty, we can leave her to your highness to play with and educate." Anyhow, we obtained a dozen or so suits of armor from those barbarian scouts of the Great Li Empire, and your highness was benevolent enough to keep the 2 most valuable suits of armor instead of selling all of them to that cowardly great general. One was bestowed to me, and one was bestowed to the lance-wielding poet over there. We've kept the 2 suits of armor with us the entire time, so after we kill those 2 men over there, it will be enough for your highness to return to the capital to ask for a reward. The emperor will definitely be delighted, especially since these are specially made suits of armor for cultivators accompanying the barbarian armies of the Great Li Empire. If we toss them at the feet of those old geezer scholarly officials in the capital, I surmise that not a single one of them will be strong enough to pick them up. Even so, I've heard that those skinny old geezers all brag about their incredible exploits in the bedroom. Prince Han Jingxin shook his head and said, "Don't repeat these words in the capital." After pausing for a moment, Han Jingxin continued in self-ridicule, "However, there's probably no need to discuss their troubles in the bedroom anymore. Even if I hold them up by the ear and loudly scold them, not a single one of them will be in the mood to criticize or impeach me. They're all looking for ways to protect themselves or flee, after all. They couldn't care less whether the emperor of the Stonebrush Nation still has the surname Han or not, and they can continue to fight for the welfare of the commoners as long as they keep their positions as officials." He glanced at the south and lamented, "My older brother, the noble king, is much more fortunate than me. He initially wanted to hide like a cowardly turtle, but who knew that his act of hiding has almost made him the new emperor? Even if he won't be able to sit on the throne for many days, he would have at least become a legitimate emperor. How can I not feel envious?" The skinny and monkey-like martial arts grandmaster had already stood up on horseback, saying, "Your Highness, you can keep discussing matters with Mr. Zhang, but please give me an instruction as well. Are we going to kill those 2 men or not? Rest assured, I won't hurt a single hair of that female ghost." Han Jingxin smiled and replied, "Go on, go ahead. And regarding that specially made suit of armor for martial secretaries of the Great Li Empire, I won't ask you to return it for nothing. When we get back, I'll reward you for both of these contributions." The skinny and monkey-like martial artist wiped his mouth and chuckled. "Following your highness around is truly great. There's always something to feast on." He was a 7th-tier martial artist who was extremely skilled at close-quarter combat, and he also possessed a powerful technique that was widely renowned and caused a huge headache for all of his opponents. As such, he genuinely couldn't find an interesting opponent in the cultivation world of the Stonebrush Nation. It was because of this that he had joined the army. He had initially joined an army under the Crown Prince's influence, yet that bookish Crown Prince was far too poor at identifying good talent, only giving him an unimportant position in the military and never giving him any tangible benefits. That being the case, he had decided to join Han Jingxin's camp instead, planning to make some profits off these tumultuous times and become a great general or the like. He especially liked Mr. Zhang's title of one-man army. In the cultivation world, how many people could he kill even if he massacred an entire clan or force? On the other hand, there would easily be tens of thousands of soldiers clashing with each other on the battlefields, allowing him to kill to his heart's content. In fact, he could even kill his own soldiers by accident. As the skinny but powerful martial arts grandmaster tapped his foot and drifted forward, Han Jingxin turned to the man holding the lance and said, "General Su, please watch over Hu Han and provide some assistance if needed, lest he slip up and get himself killed. Our opponents are cultivators from the mountain after all, so it would do well for us to be careful." The sturdy general who wasn't wearing any armor nodded and nudged his horse with its legs, commanding it to walk forward slowly. The young and strong general didn't bring any armor with him after leaving the capital, and he only brought with him the lance that was a family heirloom. General Su wasn't a fan of Prince Han Jingxin's speech and actions, but it wasn't to the point that he detested the prince. Even though Han Jingxin was eccentric, unreasonable, lustful and bloodthirsty, he was actually quite intelligent and witty. On the contrary, the bookish crown prince was a good person who was very suitable to being an emperor during peacetime. That would be a blessing to the commoners. However, he was destined for mediocrity during times of chaos. It was coincidentally a chaotic time right now, and this chaos didn't cover just a few nations. Instead, chaos was sweeping through the entire Eastern Treasured Vile continent. Influenced by the times, General Su naturally had to choose the better path for himself, even if this path was crooked from the very beginning. After Han Jingxin's two trusted subordinates, Hu Han and General Su, advanced toward the three people in front of them, Han Jingxin was already feeling at ease and not too worried about the battle that was about to take place. He continued to chat with Mr. Zeng, who was riding beside him. They were chatting about the chaotic situation unfolding in the central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent. Han Jingxin said something about this and something about that, and there didn't appear to be any logic or reason behind his words. However, Mr. Zeng didn't treat Han Jingxin's words lightly because of this. Hu Han, the skinny and monkey-like martial artist, didn't directly lunge forward after leaping off his horse. Rather, he gracefully landed in the snow before boldly walking toward the three steeds as if he were taking a stroll. Ma Dui couldn't help but feel tense, and she said in a soft voice, "They're coming." This man was a powerful subordinate of the prince, after all, and he very much looked like a grandmaster from the cultivation world who was especially skilled at close-quarter combat. When chi refiners in the lower 5 tiers were forced into close-quarter combat with pure martial artists who were like crazy dogs, which of them wouldn't suffer greatly? This was an opinion widely held by cultivators in the mountain and cultivators in the cultivator. Thus, Ma Dui couldn't help but feel anxious regardless of how much she trusted Mr. Chen. As for Zeng Yi, he didn't even dare to breathe too loudly at this moment. He had only heard about Mr. Chen's great exploits in Bamboo Scroll Lake, but he had never witnessed any of them for himself. The tall young boy had still been occasionally brushing the snow from his clothes just then, yet he was already drenched in sweat at this moment, feeling so anxious that he couldn't even feel the biting cold anymore. Chen Ping'an dismounted his horse and shook the snow from his shoulders, rolling up his sleeves at the same time. Just like the martial arts grandmaster who was unparalleled in the cultivation world of the Stonebrush Nation was doing, Chen Ping'an slowly walked toward his opponent. The atmosphere wasn't tense at all, and it was as if the two of them were friends reuniting in the cultivation world after many years apart. Ma Dui resented the fact that her soul wasn't stable enough. The fox-skin beauty talisman was a safe house for her. Yet at the same time it was also a form of restriction. She had at least been an abode-tier cultivator when alive. However, Ma Dui felt slightly deflated when she realized her abode-tier cultivation base would have most likely been of no help to Mr. Chen tonight. Her mind was truly filled with gentle kindness and warmth. "Miss Ma, Mr. Chen will be okay, right?" Zeng Yi asked in a timid voice. Ma Dui turned around to glance at the tall young boy, snapping, "Perhaps you want him to not be okay? And that way we can rely on your immense power to overcome this challenge." Zeng Yi almost choked upon hearing this, and he could offer no response to Ma Dui's words. Mr. Zeng, the swordsman who was yet to reach 40, seemingly felt some inspiration as he observed the situation and said slowly, "The barbarians from the Great Li Empire have stretched their front lines too long and thin. If the luminous Vermilion Empire can grit their teeth and hold the Great Li Empire back for another year, successfully defending against the two armies of heavy cavalry commanded by Su Gaoshan and Chao Ping and preventing them from breaching the heartlands, then they'll have a chance to continue this war and perhaps even turn the tables. The Great Li Empire has already enjoyed smooth sailing expeditions for far too long, so the coming winds of change might arrive at any moment. In fact, the key to whether the luminous Vermilion Empire can win this war or not doesn't lie with the luminous Vermilion Empire itself. Rather, the key lies with how long its vassal states can hold back the Great Li Empire. If they manage to blunt the incisiveness of Su Gaoshan and Chao Ping's armies, then the Great Li Empire will only be able to pillage the vassal states surrounding the luminous Vermilion Empire before retreating north. If I weren't completely clear about Mr. Zheng's background and identity, I would have almost started to suspect that Mr. Zheng was a supporter of the luminous Vermilion Empire, Han Jingxin joked. Mr. Zheng smiled wryly and replied, I'm nothing more than a sword practitioner who only understands some low-level sword manipulation techniques. I'm a mere pure martial artist from the cultivation world, the measliest of beings in the eyes of sword cultivators from the mountains. In fact, I didn't even dare to carry a sword with me when I traveled around the luminous Vermilion Empire for the first time during my youth. Thinking back to that utter embarrassment and humiliation, I should probably be hoping that the luminous Vermilion Empire is completely trampled into oblivion by the iron hooves of the Great Li Empire. I shouldn't be encouraging Your Highness to lay low in the capital of the luminous Vermilion Empire for a few years, only returning to the Stone Brush Nation to stabilize the situation and reap the rewards when everything clears up again. If it weren't for the Empress' trust in me, I might still be working odd jobs to make ends meet at some random place right now. Han Jingxin suddenly brought up something completely unrelated to their conversation, remarking, People all say that the Imperial Preceptor of the Great Li Empire is flawless in his planning and strategies. However, the larger vassal states of the luminous Vermilion Empire are all stubbornly resisting the advance of the Great Li Empire. Our Stone Brush Nation is no different. By the looks of it, the infiltration of the Great Li Empire spies into these vassal states has been an abject failure. The only person they managed to win over in our Stone Brush Nation is that border general from the Huang clan. Even then, it was only because the general saw a good opportunity and was loath to continue eating sand and smelling horse manure on the borders. He wanted to take a huge gamble, and it was because of this that he impulsively decided to defect to Su Gaoshan, taking with him my older brother, the noble king. The middle-aged swordsman smiled and shook his head, saying, No one in the world can truly be flawless in their planning and strategizing. There are only those who can precisely predict the trend of the world, and thus explicitly tailor their plans and actions to this trend. This is the proper way. Such wise observations from Mr. Zheng, Han Jingxin said in earnest admiration. Mr. Zheng suddenly furrowed his brows and stopped talking, focusing his gaze on the imminent battle approximately 40 paces away from them. Hu Han and the young cultivator wearing an azure cotton robe had both come to a stop already. Behind Hu Han, the lance-wielding General Su had also commanded his horse to stop. Han Jingxin was slightly puzzled as he asked, Is that young man seeking death? Not only is he refusing to retreat and unleash some immortal techniques and bonded treasures to defend himself, but he's even advancing voluntarily? Perhaps he wants to surrender and respectfully offer us that fox-skin beauty? By the looks of it, the backbones of immortals from the mountains aren't much straighter and stronger than those of mortals from outside the mountains. That beautiful ghost can count herself unlucky to have come across such an unreliable master. After all, shouldn't a disloyal bastard like me be doing this instead? Mr. Zheng didn't concur with Han Jingxin's joking remark, with his expression becoming increasingly solemn as he explained, Everything feels slightly off. This person is indeed a chi refiner, and I can sense the two small worlds circulating spiritual energy inside his body. Either his cultivation base is too low and only at the lower 5 tiers, causing the flow of his spiritual energy to be murky and obstructed, or he's concealed his sea observation tier or dragon gate tier cultivation base far too well, so much so that even I can't see through it. Or perhaps he's unexpectedly a pure martial artist instead, one whose fist intent has become completely natural. But I've been closely observing his actions after he dismounted his horse, and even though his footsteps are stable, he's largely missing the unique aura of martial artists. He looks like a complete amateur who never had a good teacher to guide him. Anyhow, I can say one thing for sure, even if we disregard these few possibilities. This young man definitely doesn't intend to surrender to us. Han Jingxin held his palms together and rubbed his jade pendant between them, chuckling. Is it possible that he's a clueless idiot who understands no fear? Perhaps he's accustomed to doing as he pleases in the mountains or in the territory of his master, So he hasn't noticed Hu Han's terrifying strength at all. That seems unlikely, Mr. Zeng replied with a shake of his head. However, he quickly corrected himself, shaking his head again and saying, "That's not the case." Han Jingxin was bored out of his mind, and he breathed large plumes of white mist into the air as he said, "Let's not guess randomly. A single punch from Hu Han, and we'll see whether that young man's made from rock or paper." Han Jingxin then lowered his voice and chuckled. "In any case, it won't be a bad thing even if Hu Han truly comes across a tough opponent. At that time, Hu Han might truly start to appreciate the 2 rewards that I bestowed upon him. This is quite a difficult thing to achieve." Mr. Zeng couldn't help but nod and laugh in speechlessness. When Han Jingxin said things, one had no option but to feel impressed by his thoughts and temperament. Prince Han Jingxin was yet to manage his own territory, yet he had already succeeded in gaining the services of the unrestrained Hu Han and the extremely haughty General Su. He hadn't achieved this by relying on his status alone. One wouldn't feel tired from watching others do the heavy lifting, and the same was true for Han Jingxin as he treated the imminent battle as a form of entertainment. Meanwhile, General Su was calm and composed as he held his lance and remained seated on his horse. Hu Han had rubbed his fists in delight and eagerness before, and his perception of the young man in azure cotton robes became increasingly clear the closer he got to him. His understanding of the situation was much more direct and clear than that of Mr. Zeng in the distance. They continued to approach each other, only coming to a stop when there were but 5 paces between them. Hu Han surprisingly felt a sense of danger, yet the smile remained on his face as he glanced at the bamboo saber and ancient sword hanging by the young man's waist. "Young boy, it can't be that you're also a pure martial artist, right?" However, Chun Ping'an unexpectedly nodded in reply and countered, "It's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Hu Han smiled with squinted eyes and replied, "Yes, of course this is a great coincidence. Since we're both from the cultivation world, I can't help myself but uphold the righteous nature of cultivators from the cultivation world. Let's make a deal, okay? You and that young boy can leave, but you need to leave behind that fox-skin ghost beauty. What do you say?" Chun Ping'an smiled and offered no response. Hu Han shifted his gaze, once again observing the depth of Chun Ping'an's footprints in the snow. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to notice any difference. Yet as a 7th-tier martial artist, Hu Han naturally possessed incredible eyesight and impressive observation abilities, allowing him to notice the smallest of details. After dismounting his horse and walking over, the footprints of the young man were noticeably uneven, with some shallow and some deep. Chun Ping'an smiled faintly and suggested, "You don't need to look. You won't be able to decipher anything useful from that. When I embarked on my second distant journey by myself and boarded an intercontinental ship, I already understood what I needed to do to conceal the information revealed by my footsteps and breathing. One should never intend to do harm to others, but one should always remain guarded against the ill intentions of others. The more I practiced fist techniques, the more this became natural, eventually becoming a habit of mine. In fact, there might be times when I'm not even aware that I'm disguising my footsteps and breathing." Hu Han faltered for a moment before clicking his tongue in wonder and remarking, "Little brother, you truly are an elite." Chun Ping'an didn't confirm or deny this, and he instead asked, "You're a Vajrabadi tier martial artist, right? But your foundation is an absolute mess. It's no better than paper mache." Hu Han chuckled and threatened, "Little brother, your words sure are hurtful. Be careful that I become unhappy and rip out your tongue." Chun Ping'an nodded and conceded, "Yes, it's all my fault. I've interacted with far too many dead people during the past few months, so I've already become accustomed to chatting more than normal. In reality, I was never when I faced enemies in the past." "No wonder," Hu Han exclaimed in realization. "That's no worry at all. As your senior in the cultivation world, I'm the complete opposite of little brother. I like to chat with people while I'm in the process of killing people." The snow under Hu Han's feet sprayed up into the surroundings. He lunged forward and threw a punch at Chun Ping'an's abdomen. Chun Ping'an placed a hand behind his back after rolling up his sleeves, using his other hand to lightly catch Hu Han's attack. Their hands only touched briefly before Chun Ping'an used the momentum to float back 4 or 5 steps. Hu Han continued to lunge forward after failing to strike his opponent with his first punch, ferociously throwing a flurry of punches. The falling snow around the short and monkey-like martial artist was violently pushed away by his powerful and abundant fist aura. Chen Ping'an used his elbow to block Hu Han's strikes, during which he slid back several more steps. 2 small steps behind him was his steed. Hu Han felt like he had roughly figured out the true strength of this mysterious young man, so he didn't plan to hold back any longer. He launched a swift and fatal attack, yet not only did the young man block his fist with his elbow, but he even unleashed a burst of explosive strength as if he were a tsunami crashing over a levee. Hu Han hurriedly suppressed his breath of pure true qi in fright and retreated several steps, with his movements still appearing smooth and confident. He was a Vajrabhati-tier martial arts grandmaster, after all. After standing still, there was a look of realization on Hu Han's face as he exclaimed, "Good one, young boy, your acting was quite good. You even managed to trick me." As it turned out, Chen Ping'an's fierce punch was seemingly wanting to fight to the death with him, yet it had only made slight contact and immediately stopped upon contact. This was analogous to a little child holding a hammer and using all of their strength to lift it up, after which the hammer promptly plummeted back down, yet it surprisingly stopped and hovered an inch or so from the ground. Most importantly, the little child seemed to struggle immensely when picking up the hammer, yet they didn't appear to be tired at all when holding it afterward. If Hu Han hadn't retreated, perhaps he could have seized the opportunity to charge forward and potentially shatter the young man's chest with a single punch. However, Hu Han was well aware that there was a much greater chance of his opponent hiding a trump card and waiting for him to charge over. For example, the hand that was held behind his back. The young man possessed masterful control over his fist aura, so even if his cultivation base wasn't high, it was most definitely the case that he had tempered his physique hundreds upon thousands of times with the help of a mighty figure. Otherwise, he had tempered his physique through countless life and death battles. Chen Ping'an shook his wrist, appearing calm and relaxed as he commented, "To say nothing of the martial arts maniac, your martial arts mastery is inferior to even Smiley Face whom I met in the past. Your cultivation base might be high, but you and Smiley Face are most likely both pure martial artists walking the same path. Your fist intent is insufficient, so you try to make up for this with movement techniques." There was a dark shadow on Hu Han's face. This wasn't to say that the most powerful martial artist of the Stonebrush Nation was feeling afraid after just a few exchanges with his opponent. This was naturally impossible. Rather, the hand clasped behind his opponent's back as well as the saber and sword hanging by his opponent's waist all made him feel slightly irritated. This was a natural instinct that martial arts grandmasters would hone through countless life and death battles. This was the most troublesome aspect. As for Chen Ping'an's remarks about his foundation being an absolute mess and no better than papier-mâché and his fist intent being insufficient and needing to be made up for with movement techniques, Hu Han couldn't care less about these nonsensical words. One can freely unleash and retract their fists as long as their mind and fists are joined together as well. When practicing fist techniques, the importance of tempering the mind can't be understated. In fact, tempering the mind is just as important for martial artists as it is for qi refiners. What follows fist intent is fist stances, and what follows fist stances is fist techniques. A Vajrabhati-tier martial artist like you won't be able to survive for many days if you're tossed into that particular place. Instead, you'll be reduced to the best whetstone for martial artists over there. Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "All right, that's enough chatter. I already understand your true strength." Hu Han also held a hand behind his back, raising his other hand and hooking his index finger to beckon Chen Ping'an over. There was a wide grin on his face as he said, "Proper behavior is based on reciprocity, so now it's your turn to attack me first, lest you feel like I'm bullying a junior and not displaying the generosity of a senior." In reality, Ironsmith Hu Han would be better off as long as they continued to engage in close-quarter combat. Parents might give their children unsuitable names, but the cultivation world would never give people incorrect nicknames. Ma Dui almost laughed out loud when she heard Chen Ping'an saying that one could freely unleash and retract their fists as long as their mind and fists were joined together. In the beginning, she had thought that Mr. Chen was randomly making this up as a joke. However, her expression quickly became serious as she looked at his figure. It couldn't be that he had genuinely learned to link his knowledge and fist intent together, right? Ma Dui wouldn't have had such strange thoughts if it were anyone else. When it came to Chen Ping'an, however, Ma Dui felt like even the slimmest of possibilities would become much greater possibilities. It was as if he could be that single exception. For example, who apart from him would sit idly in that room at the mountain entrance of Cyan Gorge Island for so long? Who apart from him would genuinely decide to leave Bamboo Scroll Lake and embark on a journey? Qian Ping'an strode forward. His movement remained calm and nonchalant, and he didn't appear like a grandmaster at all. This was in stark contrast to Hu Han, where each of his attacks would unleash a thundering fist aura and obliterate all of the snow in the surroundings. Hu Han was finally able to decipher a few things. The young man who was hiding his strength had definitely suffered some severe wounds recently, resulting in each of his attacks being like a bookkeeper carefully managing each of his small transactions, trying to eke out every last drop of profit. He was completely devoid of the heroic spirit of pure martial artists. Hu Han was overflowing with killing intent as he fully unleashed his power. However, his heart suddenly jolted, with his instinct telling him that he shouldn't allow the young man to freely throw a punch at him. However, his experience as a martial arts grandmaster from the cultivation world told him that he could eventually kill the young man as long as he charged forward and didn't hold back anymore. Hu Han's mind wavered slightly. It was also at this moment that a fist struck his body. Hu Han roared with laughter after taking the punch, jeering, "Ha ha, what was that? Are you a little girl trying to tickle me, or what?" However, it wasn't long before Hu Han wasn't able to laugh anymore. The first punch was immediately followed by a relentless flurry of punches, with each punch striking its target. It was as if he were being struck by a thundering waterfall that measured 9,000 meters in height. Hu Han did his best to block each punch, and the two of them swayed back and forth as they whipped up a wind and snowstorm on the path. Even if Hu Han were truly a papier-mâché Vajrabhati tier martial artist, he was still a Vajrabhati tier martial artist who was peerless in a nation, after all. Beads of sweat appeared on Hu Han's forehead after he blocked 7 or 8 punches. Not only was Hu Han drenched in sweat after taking 11 punches, but there was even blood seeping from the corners of his mouth. Meanwhile, the young man who was unleashing his fists quicker and quicker wasn't showing any signs of tiring or wanting to stop. Hu Han felt extremely vexed, and the mighty 7th tier martial artist eventually decided to abandon any thoughts of counterattacking. He channeled his astral energy through all of his meridians, protecting all of his critical acupoints as he allowed the young man to continually punch him. One's fist intent could be kept at the same level for a long time, but one's breath of true qi as a martial artist couldn't be maintained forever. When the young man's breath of true qi was eventually exhausted, that would be the best time for Hu Han to reply with a fist of his own. However, what Hu Han heard was the loud bellow of Mr. Zhang coming from far behind him. "General Su, make haste and help Hu Han interrupt the fist intent of that young man." General Su frowned at this request, but he didn't hesitate at all as he charged forward on his horse. He was regarded as the strongest warrior on horseback in the Stonebrush Nation, with his combat power immense as he sat on horseback and wielded his long lance. He was no ordinary martial artist. Indeed, this was the fundamental reason why Hu Han had been willing to ride alongside General Su and chat and laugh with him just then. Everything was dictated by one's true strength. As for General Su's title of lance-wielding poet that had spread throughout the imperial court of the Stonebrush Nation, this was because the emperor had granted a special exemption and allowed him to bring his lance into the imperial palace during his first audience with the emperor. Following the conclusion of the imperial court's discussions, the emperor had surprisingly instructed someone to bring over a violently tempered horse that hadn't been trained yet, asking General Su to ride on the horse with his lance in front of all of the officials. While doing so, General Su needed to use the tip of his lance to compose a renowned poem about the famous Confucian scholars of the Stonebrush Nation. Moreover, the horse had to be galloping the entire time, or else General Su would be stripped of his long lance which had been passed down as a family heirloom. As further punishment, he would also be expelled from the border army. If he succeeded, however, he would obtain rich rewards and be promoted to a 4th-rank military official. In the end, his incredible feat won him renown in the entire nation. At the time, he had lightly put down his long lance before getting on his knees at the bottom of the steps and kowtowing to the emperor, respectfully thanking the emperor for his great generosity. The young general had been shaking with emotion as he spoke with immense gratitude. Everyone thought that the young man who possessed incredible martial fortune was unable to control his excitement and gratitude. The emperor was delighted, and he had personally given General Su the title of lance-wielding poet. However, General Su had actually been feeling anger and indignation all these years, regarding this event as the most humiliating of his life. The long lance had been passed down through 4 generations and lapped up the blood of countless enemies, yet after being passed down to him, it had actually been used as something akin to a woman's needle for embroidery. Su Mao's clan had loyally served the nation for many generations, with all of his ancestors gallant and honorable as they sacrificed themselves on the battlefield without any applause or fanfare. So how could he, Su Mao, become a measly actor seeking applause and validation from others? As the general, horse, and lance surged forward, it was as if he possessed the aura of an earth-shattering battlefield. Even though Chen Ping'an and Hu Han were engaged in close-quarter combat and hard to separate, the tip of Su Mao's lance was able to remain pointing at Chen Ping'an's neck the entire time as he threw his 12th punch. Chen Ping'an didn't insist on throwing the next punch of the deity drumming technique. Everything was going as he had expected. If it wasn't the general's long lance that arrived, it would have been that middle-aged man's long sword instead. Chen Ping'an simply launched a palm strike and pushed aside Hu Han, who was yet to suffer any life-threatening injuries, causing him to stumble back and perfectly block the sharp tip of the charging general's lance. Meanwhile, he took several steps to the side. Su Mao rotated his wrist slightly, and the lance that was just about to skewer Hu Han thrust into empty air, just barely passing under the arm of the skinny and monkey-like martial arts grandmaster. Chen Ping'an forcefully stomped his foot. All the snow within a 20-meter radius of Chen Ping'an instantly flew into the air. Su Mao almost immediately shut his eyes. He then suddenly opened his eyes and raised his long lance high into the air before thrusting it forward for another attack. The tip of the lance sunk downward. A young man in azure landed on the long lance and slid down, using his knee to knock Su Mao off his horse and send him flying. However, Su Mao's grip on his lance remained extremely tight, not letting his weapon go even as he vomited a mouthful of blood. When he stood up, he discovered the young man standing on his steed and not seizing this opportunity to press his advantage. It was only then that Su Mao looked toward Hu Han, who had dashed away from the battle, roaring in rage. "Hu Han! I helped you break free from the dangerous situation. Yet you're going to stand aside and do nothing now. Are you purposely trying to harm me?" Chen Ping'an didn't look at Su Mao, and he instead looked at Han Jingxin and Mr. Zeng, who were further away, as he smiled and said, "I encourage you not to rely on him, a papier-mâché Vajrabhati-tier martial artist who's already scared out of his wits. He can't be relied on anymore." Han Jingxin's expression was slightly solemn. Su Mao and Hu Han had both been defeated? It wasn't terrifying that they had lost to the young man in both exchanges, and what was terrifying was the fact that the young man had struck a critical nerve and caused a rift between Su Mao and Han Jingxin so quickly. What would happen if Hu Han genuinely lost his courage as a martial artist? How would they fight then? Perhaps he would need to rely on Mr. Zeng, the middle-aged swordsman beside him? Hu Han was more reliable than Su Mao, but Han Jingxin had his own plans as well. Either Mr. Zeng offered his help and decided to kill that young man, or he would stay back and protect the prince with his life. If Mr. Zeng didn't join the battle, then there would still be room for discussion regardless of how bad the situation became. If Mr. Zeng joined the battle and lost as well, then would he need to personally bow and apologize at that time? Moreover, that was assuming that the young man was willing to entertain his apology and give him the opportunity to rectify the situation. It was said that some stubborn cultivators from the mountains would become merciless toward even family and friends if they truly decided to go all out for the sake of the great Tao. "Your Highness, if I don't step forward and join the battle, then the spreading rift between everyone will reduce us to nothing more than lamb to the slaughter," Mr. Zeng said in a quiet voice. "Only if I step forward is it possible that Hu Han and Su Mao will work together with me to attack and kill that young man. Of course, the prerequisite is that I'm not defeated in a single exchange." There was a forced smile on Han Jingxin's face as he replied, "You jest, Mr. Zeng." Su Mao retreated and rejoined the other cavalrymen, with his expression furious as he jumped onto another warhorse. Hu Han also wanted to retreat, but the young man immediately turned around to look at him just as he began to move. It appeared as if Hu Han had genuinely lost his courage, huffing as he stopped and stood still. However, Chan Ping'an felt that neither Hu Han nor Su Mao were as simple as they appeared. It was simply due to the complexity and fine balance of the current situation that they were holding back and unwilling to fight with their lives on the line. By the looks of it, there was an interesting dynamic between the subordinates and soldiers of Han Jingxin. Their morale was worth ruminating over. Mr. Zeng, a swordsman who had seldom ever drawn his sword, slowly advanced on his horse. There were 30 or so paces between him and Chan Ping'an. Still standing on Su Mao's horse, Chan Ping'an asked, "You're not a sword cultivator but a sword expert instead?" Mr. Zeng shook his head and replied, "I'm nowhere near deserving of such a title, especially not from you. My surname is Zeng, and I'm simply someone who wanders around the cultivation world. I go wherever I can make a living and find food." He then smiled and added, "I might not act morally in a moment." Chan Ping'an held a hand behind his back and gestured with his other hand, saying, "Do as you please." Mr. Zeng looked at Hu Han and said, "I respectfully ask you and General Su to temporarily join me, and put aside all differences, working together to slay our enemy." Chan Ping'an smiled and said, "Since Senior Zeng is a pure martial artist, you should have noticed that your Vajrabhaditier companion is relatively unique. True martial artists forcefully hold their breath of true qi to elevate their mental state, remaining fearless even when they face opponents who are one cultivation base higher. They'll accept their fate no matter what it is if they decide to engage in a life-and-death battle. However, your companion is quite outstanding, and he's missing the ability to hold that breath, and he even likes to fight with those who are one cultivation base below him. The cultivation world of the Stonebrush Nation is truly very interesting. If your companion is unfortunately the strongest martial artist in the cultivation world of the Stonebrush Nation, then every day he's alive is a day that the cultivation world of the nation is being dragged down." The corners of Su Mao's lips curled upward. It appeared as if he agreed with this assessment. However, this didn't stop him from slowly advancing with his lance again. There was a look of contemplation on Hu Han's face. Chan Ping'an unexpectedly turned to him and said, "Do you understand now? But it's a shame that you won't be able to do it." Hu Han cocked his neck and replied, "Oh? That's hard to say." Hu Han's aura immediately changed, and it was as if this version of him were finally the true Hu Han, the #1 martial artist of the Stonebrush Nation, who dominated everyone else in the cultivation world. "Mr. Zeng, General Su, let me fight first in a moment. The two of you only need to provide me with some support," Hu Han said loudly. Chan Ping'an completely ignored Hu Han's words, and he paid no heed to Su Mao, who was advancing with his lance. Amid the swirling wind and snow, the only person in Chan Ping'an's eyes was the middle-aged swordsman carrying a long sword on his back. Mr. Zeng didn't move, yet the sword on his back automatically flew out of its scabbard and soared into the sky, instantly vanishing without a trace. This was the fundamental sword manipulation technique of sword experts. Of course, this was also the main reason why sword cultivators from the mountains ridiculed and looked down on sword experts from outside the mountains. Chan Ping'an placed his left hand on the hilt of the great replica Chu Huang and remarked, "What a coincidence, I'm also a swordsman." He used his thumb to push the sword 1 inch out from its scabbard. He was like a towering mountain. It was already difficult to discern whether he was radiating with fist intent or sword intent. Su Mao involuntarily squinted his eyes due to the slightly blinding radiance. However, Su Mao was still the first to charge forward and attack. His warhorse galloped forward, carrying both him and his long lance. Hu Han was unwilling to fall behind, so he also lunged at Chan Ping'an. A carefree smile appeared on Mr. Zeng's face. His ancient sword, which had a hilt made from white jade Ganoderma, was still nowhere to be seen. Chan Ping'an strode forward from the back of the horse, striding into midair before disappearing without a trace. Hu Han coincidentally lunged over the horse and landed on the opposite road. Chan Ping'an appeared beside Su Mao in the next moment, and he used his shoulder to bump Su Mao and send both him and his horse flying. Su Mao jumped off his warhorse in midair and firmly landed on the ground. However, his steed wasn't so lucky, violently crashing into the snowy ground 30 or so meters away and immediately dying a wretched death. However, something even stranger happened. Just as Chan Ping'an had mysteriously disappeared, Mr. Zeng also disappeared without a trace. Now only that, But he even abandoned his sword scabbard, which fell onto his horse's back before sliding down and stabbing crookedly into the snow. Chen Ping'an landed on his horse and silently furrowed his brows. He gently pushed the great replica Chu Huang back into its scabbard. He then looked down at the empty scabbard in the snow. It had only been visible for a split second just then, so it was very likely that Hu Han and Su Mao hadn't noticed anything amiss with their attention being fully focused on Chen Ping'an. The sword scabbard was real, but it hadn't actually been housing a sword. Instead, it had seemingly been housing a saber. Chen Ping'an felt slightly exasperated as he murmured, "I didn't jinx myself and actually come across a saber-lending cultivator, right?" The sword scabbard was left behind. However, both Mr. Zeng and his saber were nowhere to be seen. Everything reeked of strangeness. Mr. Zeng had said the same of Chen Ping'an just then, but it was now Chen Ping'an's turn to experience the same feeling. He couldn't make heads or tails of the situation, so he decided to put it aside first and deal with the other matters at hand. Chen Ping'an used his sword manipulation techniques to casually summon the sword scabbard from the snow. He then casually flicked his sleeve, causing the scabbard to shoot forward like a flying sword. It whistled forward and pierced through the neck of Prince Han Jingxin. After confirming that the prince didn't have any death substitution talismans or other immortal treasures, Chen Ping'an turned his attention away from the corpse that was limply sliding down the horse. Chen Ping'an turned around, with his gaze shifting hesitantly between Su Mao and Hu Han. Su Mao tightly gripped his long lance and remained unmoving. Meanwhile, Hu Han was already fleeing with all his might. Chen Ping'an immediately gave chase. The two of them vanished into the heavy snow one after another. All of the elite cavalry exchanged glances with each other. They were waiting for Su Mao to issue a command. Since the sky had already collapsed, they naturally needed someone stronger to hold it up. Approximately 8 minutes later, one could vaguely make out a person in azure returning from the distance, an item in his hand. Ma Dui and Zeng Yi were almost about to go crazy. As it turned out, Su Mao had suddenly gone crazy soon after Chen Ping'an left, first gathering together the leaderless elite cavalry before suddenly erupting in violence and brutally slaughtering the 40 or so soldiers. In the end, he even squatted down and used a saber to hack off Prince Han Jingxin's head, hanging it from his waist. He then picked 3 warhorses and jumped onto one of them, treating the 2 others as relay horses that he would use during his long journey, lest the hooves of the warhorses get damaged. Su Mao didn't leave after doing all this. Instead, he silently sat on his horse and waited for Chen Ping'an to return. Chen Ping'an arrived near Su Mao and tossed Hu Han's lifeless head to the general on horseback, asking, "Care to explain?" Su Mao caught the head and hung it on his saddle, chuckling. "You've already guessed, haven't you? A future emperor of the Stone Brush Nation was killed, so as someone who was his guard, my failure to protect him can only result in the death sentence. That being the case, what else can I do? I can only defect to the Great Li Empire Su Gaoshan." Chen Ping'an didn't find this surprising in the least. "You're not going to kill me?" Su Mao asked. Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, "You've helped me clean up the mess, so why should I kill you? Killing you would be causing a whole new mess for myself." Su Mao looked at the young man who was still as deathly pale as before and chuckled. "Let's hope that you and I never meet again in the future." "That would be for the best," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. Su Mao turned his horse around, commanding it to gallop away in the wind and snow. Chen Ping'an squatted down and scooped up some snow with both hands, using it to clean his face. He was surrounded by corpses as well as wandering warhorses that were lowering their heads and gently nudging their lifeless owners. Chen Ping'an let go of the snow, causing crimson blood to drip onto the snowy ground. Ma Dui and Zeng Yi rushed over on their horses, and they were just about to say something when Chen Ping'an shook his hand and gestured for them to remain silent first. He jumped onto the back of a warhorse and gazed into the distance, peering in a direction that was slightly different from Su Mao's departure route. Chen Ping'an only sat down on the horse a short moment later, raising a hand to wipe away the blood that was starting to seep out from his nose and ears again. He had ingested a secret medicine from the Yang family's medicine shop after killing Hu Han, allowing him to not feel any pain in his body. However, it was still fairly difficult to disguise his miserable state. Otherwise, there was a risk that the fiercely ambitious Su Mao would turn around and charge back to attack him. In reality, Su Mao had indeed given this some serious thought. However, he resolutely abandoned this thought and left after being noticed by Qian Ping'an. Killing Su Mao wouldn't be difficult, but the mess caused by killing Su Mao would have to be cleaned up and borne by Qian Ping'an himself. As a result, his journey north would become filled with obstacles and troubles. There was a reason why Qian Ping'an hadn't used his 2 flying swords from the beginning to the end, nor had he used his pseudo-celestial tool. One aspect was that it wasn't against the rules of the immortal forces in the mountains for a pure martial artist to kill members of the imperial family, and even the emperor. This was because martial artists had never been regarded as cultivators from the mountains. On the other hand, qi refiners were regarded as cultivators from the mountains, and sword cultivators naturally fell into this category as well. The other aspect was that Qian Ping'an also wanted to have a hearty battle with someone, and this was due to the stroke of inspiration that General Wei from the Taoist Enforcer Temple had given him. However, it felt quite ineffective. As always, Ma Dui was better able to understand the deeper meaning behind Qian Ping'an's gesture than Zhang Yi. She had never experienced such a harrowing feeling before. Were the schemes and conflicts in the Stone Brush Nation any inferior to those in Bamboo Scroll Lake? Qian Ping'an's voice was hoarse as he said, "This is no place to linger around. We need to quickly travel at least 50 kilometers away, and find a hidden place to rest. Any place will be fine as long as we can shelter from the wind and snow." The 3 steeds set off, continuing their journey north. Qian Ping'an had no option but to directly wrap his Dao robe, golden sweet wine, around the outside of his cotton robe to conceal his miserable state. Su Mao had already traveled far away, yet the general of the Stone Brush Nation, who was now preparing to defect to the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire, suddenly stopped his horse and asked in a solemn voice, "Mr. Zhang?" Sure enough, the middle-aged swordsman walked out from the curtain of wind and snow in the distance and made his way to Su Mao's side, saying with a smile, "You can return the long lance passed down by your ancestors to me now. I believe that the clan teachings passed down by your ancestors include a sentence that no one has been able to understand during all these years. If it's possible, however, I would rather borrow a horse from you. You can keep the lance that has the characters wind and snow inscribed on it for the moment, and I'll naturally come to collect it from you someday in the future. Even if I don't personally collect it, someone will naturally come looking for military governor Su Mao of the Great Li Empire. What do you say?" There was a fervent look in Su Mao's eyes as he nodded and replied, "No problem." The middle-aged man slowly walked away with a horse. Everything about him seemed to be fake, from his identity to his sword name and background. He seemingly noticed something as he walked with the horse, and he smiled faintly and mused, "Nothing able to stop the heart, nothing able to restrain the body. So why does the mind still feel despondent?" He turned around to look in Qian Ping'an's direction, saying in disappointment, "It's a pity that there's a limit on the number of people that I can make a transaction with. It's a true pity. Otherwise, it would have most likely been a good transaction that gained me more than a military governor of the Great Li Empire." The 3 steeds traveled at varying speeds, sometimes quick and sometimes slow. Everything was determined by the state of Qian Ping'an's wounds. In Ma Dui's eyes, however, Mr. Chen's mental state was seemingly unchanged even though he was nursing relatively severe wounds. Winter is a time for dense snowfall, the crunch underfoot like clinking jade. Have you heard of this saying before?" Qian Ping'an suddenly asked. "Yes, I have," Ma Dui replied with a nod. You are indeed knowledgeable and well-read. You haven't been a disappointment to your name," Qian Ping'an said. Ma Dui suppressed a laugh and added, "I heard this saying for the first time just now." Qian Ping'an faltered for a moment before chuckling. "This joke is just like the chilly wind and snow." Ma Dui was slightly puzzled. She started to carefully ruminate on Mr. Chen's words. Zhang Yi solemnly commented, "Mr. Chen is probably trying to say that Miss Ma's jokes are cold and biting." Ma Dui's face was full of suspicion as she looked at Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an chuckled and asked, "Do you really believe Zheng Ye's words?" Ma Dui thought about this for a moment and felt like Qian Ping'an was correct. She shot an intense glare at Zheng Yi. Zheng Yi couldn't help but feel slightly aggrieved. Ma Dui hesitated for a long time, but she ultimately didn't dare to say anything. "Do you want to ask about gathering the souls of those cavalrymen?" Qian Ping'an asked. Ma Dui felt a little guilty as she replied, "I feel like there's absolutely no need, but But you feel like my head is screwed on wrong. And I always like to do strange and complicated things, right? Chen Ping'an asked with a smile. Being able to say something meant that the matter wasn't weighing on his mind. This was a good thing. Ma Dui's mood improved greatly, causing a faint smile to spread across her face. In reality, as long as one understands the beginning and end of a path, one doesn't need to be afraid even if the current situation is a convoluted mess. Everything will be fine as long as one takes things slowly, Chen Ping'an said. Ma Dui's habit of being stubborn and literal cropped up again, and she asked, "Didn't Mr. Chen just say that we need to quickly travel at least 50 kilometers away? Why don't we take things slowly?" Chen Ping'an poured out a secret alchemical pill from the water palace, drinking a sip of wine before ingesting the pill. He felt slightly exasperated, but he didn't offer any retort. Ma Dui started to chuckle to herself. Zheng Yi shook his head. Women. The three steeds galloped through the wind and snow. Chen Ping'an and his two companions navigated through the dangerous wind and snow as they continued their journey to the heartlands of the Stonebrush Nation. Many strategically critical cities with tall walls had already become wastelands devastated by the flames of war. On the other hand, most regional areas had been fortunate enough to escape the catastrophe of war. However, many people fleeing their homes had unfortunately been punished by the 3 bouts of heavy snow following the arrival of winter, resulting in many emaciated and frozen corpses being littered on the sides of the official roads. There were young men, women, children, and people of all genders and ages. Ma Dui was a kind-hearted ghost, while Zheng Yi was a pure and down-to-earth young boy. Neither the ghost nor person appeared like true cultivators from Bamboo Scroll Lake. So when Chen Ping'an arrived at a prefectural city and said that he wanted to find a local to help him set up kanji stalls and medicine shops, and that they would continue their journey after this was done, both Ma Dui and Zheng Yi were especially happy with his plan. After getting everyone's agreement, Chen Ping'an retrieved the jade tablet that signified his status as a guest elder of Cyan Gorge Island, and hung it on the opposite waist to his saber and sword. He visited the local government office, and Ma Dui wore a veiled hat to cover her appearance and even put on a thick coat in a very excessive display. She used it to conceal her lithe figure as a fox-skin beauty. They had already passed many prefectures and counties before this, and the further north they traveled and the closer to the central region of the Stonebrush Nation they ventured, the more destruction and death they witnessed. They could already see more soldiers and horses, with some of them being remnant armies and brave wanderers who were retreating south after suffering defeat. Some soldiers were wearing new and glistening suits of armor, making them appear very legitimate and mighty. Zheng Yi felt like these warriors might be able to rival the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire when they hurried to the battlefield in the north. However, Chen Ping'an knew very well that these soldiers, who were wearing suits of armor and holding gleaming weapons that appeared brand new even after being gathered from the arsenals of various regions after many years of storage, would die very quickly after charging onto the battlefields. Only a small number of lucky soldiers would have the opportunity to slowly transform from newbies confused about how everyone had died to veteran soldiers who knew how to survive. During his journey through the River of Time in the Lotus Flower-blessed land, Chen Ping'an had personally witnessed many brutal wars that decided the fortunes of the 4 nations. In the majestic world, Chen Ping'an had also personally witnessed the formations of the Great Li Empire's armies and scouts. Seeing these things was enough for Chen Ping'an to understand the inevitable trend, also allowing him to understand why the border army of the Great Li Empire enjoyed the title of warriors above the mounds. These were mounds built up from countless corpses. For those soldiers who survived after dozens of battles, it could be said that a young soldier of 20 years old from the Great Li Empire had perhaps fought more battles and seen more dead bodies than an influential general of 40 or 50 years old from the Stonebrush Nation. In fact, Chen Ping'an was thinking even further than this. The Stonebrush Nation was one of several vassal states of the luminous Vermilion Empire, and ignoring those like Huang He and Han Jingling and only focusing on the actions of the majority, many were still willing to resist the invasion of the Great Li Empire. For example, Han Jingxin, who had died at his hands, had dared to hunt and kill a scout of the Great Li Empire who had been accompanied by 2 cultivators. Before becoming Yin entities, General Wei's soldiers had bravely fought until all of them were killed. Meanwhile, the Emperor of the Stonebrush Nation was still doing everything in his abilities to mobilize troops from around the nation to stubbornly block the southward path of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry. Moreover, He continued to defend the capital without any signs of wanting to surrender, even though they were now surrounded. Why was the Stonebrush Nation willing to do this? Why were they willing to sacrifice so many lives to barely hinder the advance of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry commanded by Su Gaoshan? Literati wrote in the books that winter is a time for dense snowfall, the crunch underfoot like clinking jade. Chen Ping'an looked up and gazed into the distance. There was snow on the path just as there was snow on the mountains. It was as if the heavens were placing a huge burden on the mortal world. Chen Ping'an heaved a soft sigh. However, he felt slightly better after recalling the ringing of armor and courage in the Taoist Enforcer Temple that night. Ma Dui fared relatively okay during their journey north. She had been an official immortal before, and she had also been a vagrant cultivator in Bamboo Scroll Lake. It was inevitable that she felt sorrow due to what she witnessed, but she wasn't overly shocked by these tragic scenes. Zhang Yi had frequently shed tears in silence in the beginning, yet after witnessing the same living hell day after day and week after week, even he started to become slightly numb and desensitized. During their journey, Zhang Yi was possessed by malign entities again and again, with some managing to complete their final wishes, and some being forced to contend with one final regret and disappointment. Their home nation and hometown were no longer the same as before. Similarly, the femaline entities who were staying in the foxskin beauty talismans also left the world one after another, for example Su Xinjai. Afterward, other femaline entities would continue to take their place, borrowing the power of the talismans to walk in the living world. The foxskin beauty talismans were like inns and ferry stations, allowing entities to come and go as they experienced both joy and sorrow. There were farewells transcending the borders of yin and yang, and there were truths and concealments following the final wishes of the yin entities. Chen Ping'an visited the prefectural overseer's office with Ma Duyi and Zhang Yi today, facing no obstruction or challenges as they made their way in. The prefectural overseer was an obese old man whose eyes could barely be seen, and he liked to smile whenever he met with anyone on official business, causing his eyes to become even more hidden. The old prefectural overseer's life had been anything but peaceful in the past year, what with war tearing through the nation and chaos taking place everywhere. Apart from spending an exorbitant amount of money to recruit an immortal from the nearest immortal abode to leave the mountains and guard the prefectural city, he also recruited 2 cultivators of unknown backgrounds in an act of desperation. To put things bluntly, the old prefectural overseer had recruited 2 lower 5-tier vagrant cultivators, people whom he had somewhat looked down on in the past. The official immortal who was also at the lower 5-tier was loath to work with vagrant cultivators, so he had almost left in anger and directly returned to the mountains. After much persuasion from the prefectural city, he was offered an additional 3 snowflake coins a month to stay behind. Only then was the official immortal willing to work with the vagrant cultivator whom he detested. The prefectural overseer felt extremely pained to part with more money, but he immediately felt much better about spending an additional 3 snowflake coins a month after Chen Ping'an came to visit. This was because the official immortal displayed why vagrant cultivators could never compare to official immortals like him. He immediately noticed the value of Chen Ping'an's jade tablet, and he could tell that it was definitely a genuine treasure. Simply put, he recognized the high-grade guest elder jade tablet from Cyan Gorge Island, something that was almost loftier than the heavens. He trembled in fear, and he almost fell to his knees to kowtow to the young immortal from Bamboo Scroll Lake. What followed afterward was very easy to deal with. The esteemed guest elder who claimed to have the surname Chan said that he wanted to set up kanji stalls and medicine shops in the prefectural city to help the civilians. He needed to trouble the prefectural overseer with providing the necessary power, which he would of course pay for. At this moment, Ma Dui and Zhang Yi were finally able to see the old prefectural overseer's eyes. They were wide with astonishment, and they truly couldn't be regarded as small. He most likely found Chen Ping'an's proposal to be absurd, and the official immortal standing beside him fared no better. This was an incredibly kind person hailing from Bamboo Scroll Lake? Was this any different from a great demon constructing a manor and calling themselves an esteemed immortal? Meanwhile, the 2 vagrant cultivators who appeared respectful and timid exchanged a glance and didn't say anything. Afterward, something even stranger happened, with the young guest elder Chan asking the old prefectural overseer to summon a group of officials and petty officials who were well versed in tax affairs, merchant affairs, and arithmetic. Everyone sat down together and started to discuss the specifics of setting up the kanji stalls and medicine shops, going over the current price of rice and medicine, the amount of rice in the official granaries, the approximate number of local residents and fleeing civilians, the possible locations for the stalls and shops, the number of people who could be mobilized to help without detrimentally affecting official matters, and so on and so forth. They carefully worked through every single detail, causing the group of officials to feel like they were battling against a huge enemy. Following the conclusion of the meeting, the prefectural overseer immediately instructed his subordinates to work on the matter through the night. The officials and petty officials also left to carry out their tasks. Qian Ping'an and his two companions stayed in the backyard of the prefectural overseer's office, and the two vagrant cultivators secretly paid them a visit when it was already very late at night. They weren't afraid of the so-called guest elder Chun from Gorge Island at all, and their attitude was in stark contrast to the respect and apprehension that they had shown during the day. One of the vagrant cultivators rubbed his thumb and index finger together, smiling as he asked Qian Ping'an whether it was time for the guest elder to give them some hush money. As for what guest elder Chun was planning in the prefectural city, whether he wanted to obtain people, money, or immortal treasures, the two of them would turn a blind eye. Ma Dui and Zengyi stayed in Qian Ping'an's room and enjoyed a rare casual chat. This was because the slightly slow Zhang Yi was unable to understand something. Mr. Chun was clearly doing what he wanted to do a little at a time, and even though there were some challenges and imperfect endings along the way as well as some small disappointments due to incomplete wishes, there were ultimately many ghosts and entities of the Stonebrush Nation who were able to complete their final wishes and leave with less disappointment, just like Miss Su. Theoretically speaking, Mr. Chen's mental state should have become more and more relaxed. However, this wasn't the case in reality. Thus, under the condition that they didn't disturb Mr. Chun, Ma Dui and Zengyi would accompany him, with Ma Dui making random small talk most of the time. Qian Ping'an never found them annoying, but he wasn't especially fond of talking either. However, he would occasionally smile when he heard Ma Dui and Zengyi arguing about trivial matters or speaking nonsense to pass time. Ma Dui and Zengyi found this a little strange. They felt like Mr. Chen never smiled or reacted when they said something funny, so why was he smiling when they said something that wasn't funny at all? With their feet on the small charcoal stove under the table as they snacked on roasted seeds, both the human and the ghost were extremely amused as they looked at the two vagrant cultivators acting smart in front of Mr. Chun. Ma Dui narrowed her eyes, very curious about how bookkeeper Chun would handle the situation. Qian Ping'an smiled and asked, "Then how many snowflake coins is a fair amount to give you as hush money?" One of the vagrant cultivators had thought this through long ago, and he replied, "Little brother, you were able to forge a guest elder jade tablet from Gorge Island, and you even managed to trick an official immortal into believing it was real. This points to a huge plot, and you further invested a significant amount of gold and silver into the matters regarding the kanji stalls and medicine shops that we discussed tonight. With this in mind, the hush money should at least be 40 to 50 snowflake coins, right? What do you say, little brother? Are you willing to sacrifice a small amount of money to safely earn the big money?" Qian Ping'an extended his hands and placed them on the shoulders of the two vagrant cultivators, saying, "Since I've been found out by my two seniors, it will be a better option to kill and silence you rather than pay you some hush money or whatnot. After all, what if you take my money and suddenly feel like it's not enough after returning home? What if I give an inch and you take a mile? Not only will that be troublesome, but you might even ruin my grand plans. That being the case, I might as well get on the front foot and kill you first. What do the two of you say?" The two vagrant cultivators were in a state of absolute shock right now. The hand on their shoulders was surprisingly shaking their acupoints and obstructing their spiritual energy. Before the two vagrant cultivators could open their mouths to beg for forgiveness, Qian Ping'an put on a stern expression and continued, "My plans are far-reaching, so perhaps the two of you can provide me with some minor help. If you want to leave the prefectural city alive, however, then pay up some money to buy your lives back. Even though you're only lower 5-tier cultivators, the two of you should at least have 40 or 50 snowflake coins between you, right?" The two vagrant cultivators weren't wealthy to begin with, and it was as if they had lost something extremely dear to them as they scraped together 32 snowflake coins and told Qian Ping'an that they genuinely had no more. Qian Ping'an accepted the immortal coins and waved a hand, instructing, "The two of you should keep a low profile after returning. Wait for my instructions, and if you're smart enough and obedient enough, Then I might throw you some scraps after I succeed. If you dare to try anything funny, however, then I'll directly rip out the bonded items from your acupoints, things that are genuinely worth some money. No one will be able to save you at that time, and you'll start to regret ever coming over to the prefectural overseer's office to threaten me." The two vagrant cultivators managed to keep their clothes and their lives, so they were filled with surprise and delight as they left the prefectural overseer's office. Perhaps they could transform this misfortune into fortune? After returning home and discussing things further, the two vagrant cultivators had a nagging feeling that this was still unreliable and risky. However, they didn't dare to sneak away. And they were also feeling pained about losing the 30 or so snowflake coins that they had earned with blood, sweat, and tears. They couldn't help but sigh again and again as they worried about their gains and losses. Ma Dui and Zheng Yi chuckled in amusement. "We'll return the snowflake coins to them when we leave the prefectural city," Qian Ping'an said as he sat beside the table. He then turned to Zheng Yi and continued, "We might need to open more kanji stalls when we travel to the cities further north. However, we need to consider the available opportunities and local conditions of each place before we set anything up. We'll push these matters aside for the moment, and there's no need for the two of you to ponder over them as I naturally have my own plans already. When we do set up any future kanji stalls, however, Zheng Yi will be the one to organize and manage them. You'll be responsible for discussing the details with the local officials, and you don't need to worry about making mistakes in the process, nor do you need to worry about spending too many silver coins. These matters aren't very important. Also, even though I won't engage in the actual discussions, I'll still accompany you to help you watch over things." Zheng Yi nodded earnestly first, following which a look of hesitation appeared on his face. It looked like he wanted to say something. Taking the first step is always the most difficult, but one eventually has to take that first step, right? Qian Ping'an said. Zheng Yi didn't say anything else, feeling both uneasy and happy at the same time. Compared to cultivation, it seemed as if this responsibility made the young boy feel even happier and more comfortable. When you feel tired or annoyed with these matters, remember that it's not embarrassing to say so and to tell me honestly. After all, your main focus should still be cultivation, Qian Ping'an added. Zheng Yi nodded vigorously and replied, "Rest assured, Mr. Qian. I definitely won't delay my cultivation." Qian Ping'an smiled upon hearing this. In reality, the young boy would most likely work even harder in the future. Qian Ping'an and his companions chose some suitable locations for the kanji stalls and medicine shops in the prefectural city, quickly and methodically working through the necessary steps to bring everything to life. The prefectural overseer's office was familiar with these matters, and it also helped that the prefectural overseer was personally overseeing everything. As for the identity of the young man in azure cotton robes, the old prefectural overseer spoke in a vague and mysterious manner, not revealing it to anyone else. This caused them to respect and fear Qian Ping'an even more. 3 days later, Qian Ping'an asked Ma Dui to secretly return the 32 snowflake coins to the rooms of the two vagrant cultivators. Afterward, the three of them traveled to a kanji stall near the city gates, stopping their horses far away before dismounting. Qian Ping'an asked an official immortal who had accompanied them to help look after the horses for a moment. After arriving at the kanji stall, Ma Dui was unwilling to act as a beggar, while Zheng Yi felt like he didn't need to eat a bowl of rice kanji that was as bland as water. Thus, Qian Ping'an went to patiently line up by himself, receiving a bowl of kanji that could just barely be regarded as thick. He also received 2 steamed rolls, and he squatted down next to the path and started to eat. He could hear the petty officials calling out from time to time, loudly telling the impoverished locals and arriving refugees the rules of the kanji stalls. They couldn't be greedy, and each person could only receive 1 serving of kanji and steamed rolls. They shouldn't eat too quickly either, or else they would get in trouble if they choked or became bloated. Qian Ping'an looked at the snaking lines, and among them were quite a large number of local men who were healthy and well-dressed. There were even some people who brought their children along, with the children enjoying tonghulu as they waited in line. There was a group of local men not far from Qian Ping'an, and none of them appeared weak or emaciated. As they ate the kanji and steamed rolls, they complained that this food was even worse than pig feed. Qian Ping'an silently ate his food, unfazed by what he saw and heard. This was because he knew that worldly matters were just. It was very difficult to appreciate and cherish what came for free. If one spent money to buy the same thing, however, they would perhaps feel like it tasted better, even if it were just rice congee and steamed rolls. At the very least, they wouldn't grumble and complain like the group of men. Chen Ping'an returned the congee bowl before walking over to Ma Dui and Zheng Yi and saying, "Let's go." The three of them jumped on their horses and left the prefectural city. Ma Dui was very observant, and she noticed something off after frequenting the congee stalls and medicine shops with Zheng Yi over the past few days. After leaving the prefectural city, she finally couldn't hold back anymore, complaining, "Mr. Chan, at least 30% of the silver we gave them was pocketed by those sly officials in the prefectural overseer's office. At the very least, even I managed to see through them so easily, so how did you not notice anything, Mr. Chan? Why didn't you scold that prefectural overseer?" "Is that so?" Chen Ping'an replied. Ma Dui was almost angered to death. Meanwhile, Zheng Yi was stunned. The young boy was truly unaware of what had taken place. After all, how could he see through the schemes and intricacies of officialdom? Ma Dui became increasingly angry upon seeing no reaction from Chen Ping'an, and she fumed, "Mr. Chan, I won't help you next time if you keep ignoring the problem. You can ask Zheng Yi, that silly young boy, to do everything by himself. Let's see if he improves the situation or makes it even worse." Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before giving Ma Dui an explanation that wasn't exactly an explanation, saying, "Since we're doing a good deed, we shouldn't be too pedantic as long as we roughly achieve our goals. We don't need to strive for perfection. I was mentally prepared to lose 30% of the funds to their corruption, and my bottom line was actually even lower. I would have accepted it even if the participating officials pocketed 40% of the funds. Be it 30% or 40%, we can treat this as payment they received for doing a tangible good deed." Ma Dui hadn't expected this answer at all. She wanted to become angry, yet she couldn't do so no matter what. In the end, she decided not to say anything at all. Chen Ping'an smiled and suggested, "If you feel dissatisfied about this, then I'm willing to change my bottom line from 40% to 20% as long as you're willing to help Zhang Yi. What do you say?" Ma Dui was very satisfied with this proposal, and only after hearing this from Chen Ping'an did she ride up to Zhang Yi and start to patiently discuss strategies with the simple and naive young boy. Chen Ping'an suddenly instructed his horse to slow down, retrieving a small rectangular box from his sleeve that was inscribed with ancient seal script characters. This was a small gift from Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuani, and it could be viewed as a show of sincerity after the three of them formed an alliance. The small rectangular box was an extremely rare item. A small sword resting ground of very good quality that measured just 1 finger in length. It was exquisite and small, and it could be easily carried around and used to store messenger flying swords. Of course, the small sword resting ground wasn't as flexible as large sword chambers, and it could only send and receive 1 messenger flying sword at a time. At the same time, it expended far more spiritual energy to nurture flying swords compared to ordinary sword chambers. Even so, Chen Ping'an could definitely sell the small sword resting ground for 1 grain rain coin as long as he was willing to part with it. Thus, Chen Ping'an naturally hadn't turned down Tan Yuani's act of goodwill. After opening the slightly shaking rectangular box, Chen Ping'an retrieved a messenger flying sword that had come from Cyan Gorge Island. The letter said that after learning that he was already in the Stonebrush Nation, Palace Willow Island's Lu Laoqing had asked Cyan Gorge Island to pass on a single sentence. "Come to Palace Willow Island to discuss the price in more detail when you return." Chen Ping'an tightly gripped a snowflake coin, causing spiritual energy to flow into a sword holder in the rectangular box like dripping water. He then activated an ingenious mechanism in the box, causing the messenger flying sword from Cyan Gorge Island to shoot out of the sword holder and disappear with a flash, flying back to Bamboo Scroll Lake. Zhang Yi was completely engrossed in this process. He had worked as an errand boy in the simple sword chamber in Thatch Moon Island before, but this was the first time that he had ever seen a small sword resting ground, something that he had only heard about before. It was truly as mysterious as could be. Ma Dui didn't fare much better than him. Chen Ping'an placed the small sword resting ground into his sleeve and breathed some warm air into his hands. This was a big piece of good news. Just like he had said to Zhang Yi, the most difficult thing in the world was often taking that first step. After taking the first step, it was also of utmost importance whether one could stand firm and steady. Chen Ping'an mysteriously became allies with Lu Jimao, who should have been his enemy, and Tan Yuani, who was a spy of the Great Li Empire. Afterward, he had walked into a risky situation, visiting Palace Willow Island to have a discussion with Lu Laocheng. And now, he was visiting various regions of the Stonebrush Nation to make up for past mistakes and gain a deeper understanding of the nation's fortunes at the same time. He was naturally here with a goal. Chen Ping'an had engaged in a discussion with Gu Kan's mother at his residence near the mountain entrance of Cyan Gorge Island, but his auntie might not have paid much heed to his words at the time. She most likely wouldn't have given much thought to the matters that he had talked about in a seemingly casual manner, and it was even possible that she might have treated them as inconsequential. Her thought process was actually quite simple, and she hoped that Chen Ping'an could protect her and Gu Kan from the sudden change sweeping through Bamboo Scroll Lake. She hoped that the young bookkeeper could cherish their old relationship and live up to his name of peace and safety. Among Chen Ping'an's words, he had said that Bamboo Scroll Lake might become different in the future. Gu Kan's mother might not have thought deeply about this. However, Chen Ping'an had already started to make preparations. Chen Ping'an was going to advance his plan step by step, with his action being perfectly described by Lu Laocheng's 2 joking remarks on the boat. He was pulling no stops, and he was displaying lofty ambitions. This was because Lu Laocheng had already noticed the signs and guessed that Chen Ping'an wanted to change the rules of Bamboo Scroll Lake from the most fundamental roots. He was going to borrow external power and he was going to try his utmost. Chen Ping'an put aside discussing the good and evil of people first, and the first thing he focused on doing was treating everyone as a go piece and trying his best to draw a larger go board that belonged to himself. This included everything from the go pieces to the go shape and then to the go formations. He hoped that he could at least participate in guiding the overarching rules of Bamboo Scroll Lake in the future, and be able to establish his own rules. It was because of this that Lu Laocheng had asked Chen Ping'an whether he had learned to play Go from the Jewel Small World's Mr. Qi. This was the reason behind the matters. Chen Ping'an and Lu Laocheng had actually been having a tug-of-war with their words. There were many hidden undercurrents and schemes on the Go board, and finding the weaknesses of one's opponents, making seemingly unreasonable moves, and making seemingly godly moves were all done with some form of consideration or reason. Regardless of whether it was against the upper 5-tier Lu Laocheng in Palace Willow Island or against the nascent tier Lu Jimao in Cyan Gorge Island, Chen Ping'an was actually using his fists and influence to do the talking. If he crossed the line and accidentally became involved in the battle for the Great Tao, obstructing any of them from attaining Tao, however, then he would essentially be seeking death. Since the gulf in power between Chen Ping'an and the two of them was so great, it was only natural that speaking reason with them wouldn't yield any results. Using his fists to speak reason would further be seeking death. However, Chen Ping'an wanted to achieve a certain goal, so what could he do? In that case, he could only pour all of his effort into cultivating his mind, carefully contemplating the weight and influence of all the Go pieces that were hidden and formless. He needed to contemplate their desires, bottom lines, temperaments, and rules. If it were possible, Chen Ping'an wanted to try and make transactions with Prince Han Jingling, who had fled to Bamboo Scroll Lake, Huang He, who was the son of a great general, and even General Su Gaoshan of the Great Li Empire, who carried the unstoppable trend of the Great Li Empire. Chen Ping'an was seeking to put his mind at ease by making up for past mistakes and helping the ghosts and entities complete their final wishes. However, what was more difficult than this was the other game of Go that he was secretly working on. This was the first time that Chen Ping'an was attempting to craft a Go board as a player rather than a piece. Most importantly, he couldn't make a single wrong move, or else a single slip-up would cost him the entire game. Chen Ping'an making a mistake would be equivalent to him having a massive brain fade in planning. Regarding the former goal, he was preventing Gu Kan from making any more mistakes since the young boy was unwilling to see the errors in his way. He was going to make up for these mistakes himself. Apart from exhausting his mental energy and money, there was already no risk of Chen Ping'an losing anything more. As such, he didn't need to feel as if he were walking on thin ice. However, since Chen Ping'an was so good at concealing his emotions, how had even Zhang Yi managed to notice the subtle fluctuations in his mental state before? This was because Chen Ping'an had come across an even bigger and seemingly unsolvable disappointment after seeing off Su Xinjai and the others. This disappointment lingered in his mind and wouldn't fade away no matter what. This feeling was different from what he had experienced in the slightly dark and gloomy room near the mountain entrance of Cyan Gorge Island. He hadn't summoned all of the Een souls and allowed them out back then, and just taking a single glance at the hall of the underworld on the table would bring him huge troubles when he closed his eyes to nap or sleep. It was as if countless malicious ghosts who had been wronged before death were banging on the door to his mind and loudly voicing their grievances and cursing him. After sending off many ghosts and Een entities, Qian Pingan's feeling of disappointment stemmed from a discovery that he had made. Of the many names of the wrongly killed victims recorded in his notebooks, those whom he felt the most guilty toward all let go of their obsessions very readily, choosing to leave the living world once and for all. For example, Su Xinjai, who had always remembered her respected master in Yellow Barrier Mountain. On the other hand, those whom he felt less guilty toward would often have more requests and more unreasonable final wishes, putting on full display their greed, which was common to both humans and ghosts. There were many more Een entities who displayed even more hatred and resentment after death, and these Een entities were temporarily residing in Qian Pingan's Hall of the Underworld and Colored Glazed Pagoda. In reality, Qian Pingan had already felt much less guilty after deciding to make up for past mistakes. However, the reactions of Su Xinjai and the others had caused him to start feeling guilty again. In fact, he felt even guiltier than before. The emotions displayed by Su Xinjai and the others also lingered outside the door to his mind, yet they were already resolute on leaving the living world, and they didn't harbor any complaints or unleash any verbal abuse. Rather, they would lightly knock on the door, with their movements so gentle that it appeared as if they were worried about disturbing the person inside. Afterward, they would all bid farewell the same way, saying, "I'm leaving now, Mr. Qian." Qian Pingan suddenly squeezed the belly of his horse, causing it to gallop forward and leave the muddy official road, taking a detour and ascending a small mountain ridge. The horse navigated up the uneven mountain ridge. Qian Pingan tugged the reins, stopping his horse at the peak of the ridge. Zheng Yi wanted to pat his horse and catch up to Qian Pingan, yet he was stopped in his tracks by Ma Dui. Qian Pingan was at a loss as he looked around. There was a sword nurturing gourd, a sword, and a saber hanging by his waists, and he could even ride a horse through the wind and snow-filled cultivation world. He was alone with nothing to depend on.